Good morning. Welcome to the Committee of the Whole meeting for Tuesday, October 22nd, 2019 for the District of Squamish. Akan Squalam, Quist Collective, Class Squamish, Aweme. Welcome to the traditional territory of the Squamish Nation. We have an amended agenda this morning, and I'm looking for a motion to adopt the amended agenda. One item has been deleted. Councillor French, second Councillor Herford. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Now, one of our councillors, Councillor Stoner, is on the telephone, and so I have to read out a little blurb. Council members attending the meeting electronically are required to advise the chair of the meeting of the following circumstances. A, when the council member disconnects and/or reconnects, in other words, enters or exits the meeting, so that this can be recorded in the minutes of the meeting. With respect to a vote, council members are only required to state a nay vote. No statement is required if the member is in favor. Council members should put the telephone on mute unless they wish to speak. Council members shall be involved in and participate in the meeting. Council members shall text the Chief Administrative Officer or the Corporate Officer if they have technical difficulty with their telephone. And in this case, Councillor Stoner, it will be the Corporate Officer, Ms. Arthurs. And the meeting shall be recessed for up to 10 minutes if a technical difficulty occurs on the district side, which results in the council member being unable to be connected to the meeting. And also, Councillor Stoner, as I advised you, if you wish to be put on the speakers list, just state chair and I will acknowledge you, but we'll continue on with the discussion until the appropriate time for speakers. So, any questions about that, Councillor Stoner?
No, that all works for me. Thank you.
Okay. So the first item, staff reports, District of Squamish zoning bylaw number 2200-2011 amendment bylaw for CD90 zone on Centennial Way, and I'll turn it over to staff. I will say at the outset though, the purpose of this coming to Committee of the Whole, as you'll recall, we have, first reading has been passed, we have not yet passed second reading. We wanted it to come to Committee of the Whole as opposed to go directly to second reading at a bylaw, at a regular business meeting, to allow council to express any positives or negatives. There's been some changes to this proposal, and this is the opportunity really for council to express those thoughts, to assist staff and to assist the proponent in developing the bylaw. So that is the primary purpose. Speak your mind by all means. There will be a discussion. There will not be sort of a vote of yay or nay at this time. It will more or less be to go to second reading or back to staff for further discussion. With that, I'll turn it over to staff. I'm sorry, there was one other point I'm going to mention. It is my preferred practice in a rezoning matter such as this to have all the information come to council through staff. I don't expect the proponent or a member of the public to be speaking today. We've had some difficulties with that in the past with unrelated applications. However, having said that, I want staff, I know there's members of the proponent that are in the meeting today, and if staff wish to consult with them, feel free. If you wish to ask for a short recess to do that, feel free, so that you can get whatever information we might need. Having said that, Ms. Naseby, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Race, and good morning, Council. This morning I'm here supported with some other staff members. I'm Elaine Naseby, I'm a planner with Community Planning. We've got David Rolston, Manager of Municipal Infrastructure, who can speak to any dike-related and flood hazard items. We have Laura Princek, Municipal Engineer, who can help with discussions with the roundabout, parking, active transportation. And we have Matt Gunn, who can help support on anything that might come up with OCP, land use designation, zoning, employment, that sort of thing. So, as Chair Race mentioned, this has been to council. It had first reading with our last council in July 2018, and it went for second reading in June of this year. It is a rezoning from the current CD73 campground zone to a CD90 comprehensive development zone that aligns with the OCP's mixed employment land use designation. The location is the previous Whistlepunk Hollow RV park land, so there's two separate parcels. And the proposal divides the site into 3 sites. So there's site 1 is the northern parcel at 1701 Centennial. Sites 2 and 3 are the southern parcel, 1940 Centennial Way. The sites are very centrally located in Squamish. They're close to Brennan Park Recreation Center. They're on Centennial Way, which is a truck route with industrial lands to the east. We have a district-owned parcel at 42,000 Loggers Lane to the west, and the recently developed Seven Peaks townhomes to the south. And then we've got the Mamcram River directly north, and the Squamish River Watershed Society, Mamcram Reunion Project channels also to the east. This is a bird's eye view of the proposed development that shows the mix of land uses. And so in our 2040 OCP, these lands were designated as mixed employment. That was in consideration of its central location, need to provide employment space and services for the growing residential neighborhood in the Brennan Park area. I'll just read out the definition of mixed employment. It applies to lands intended for a creative, complementary, and flexible mix of employment generating uses in transitional employment and light industrial areas. Supported uses include civic, institutional, artisan, arts, culture, limited retail, business office, professional office, light industrial, residential mixed use, parks and greenways. Actually, I'll just go back. So the red or pink color there that we see on the screen is the residential use. The purple is employment uses. And we have a purpose-built residential rental building with affordable units in it in yellow. There is quite a consideration of active transportation in this centrally located development. So it connects with trails to Brennan Park, the existing Mamcram River Dike. There's additional trails within and adjacent to the proposal. And then I'll walk through the different elements of the site. So on that northern parcel there, that is a 6-story mixed-use building of commercial at grade, 2nd-story office, and 4 stories of residential apartments above. These are townhomes that are fronting on Centennial Way, and those 2 elements conceal the facade of an underground concealed parkade that would abut the dike. On the south site, we have office use in blue and a purpose-built daycare facility for 25 children in purple. This is that 5-story residential, so purpose-built rental building with affordable units. And the south site has townhomes. This second level is a second level overlay on top, so this is above those concealed parking areas. We have the mixed-use building close to Centennial and Loggers intersection there. These are townhomes that are fronting onto the Mamcram River and Mamcram River Dike, as well as along Centennial. This is a light industrial building that fronts onto Centennial Way on the south parcel, and this is a second level of office use above the office and daycare, and this is that purpose-built rental building. So this is an overview of the proposal. It includes employment and residential uses on both parcels. So in total, there's 18,500 square feet of office use, a total of 266 housing units, and 80 purpose-built apartments, 24 of which are affordable. The townhomes on the southern site at first reading, they numbered 84, and then at second reading, that density was reduced to 75 townhomes. I'll review the community amenity contribution of this rezoning. So as mentioned, there are 24 affordable units. The applicant did revise the amount of these since our second reading, in increasing the number of the larger 3 bedrooms. So there's now 6 units proposed to be 3-bedroom units, 6 as 2-bedroom, and 12 units as 1-bedroom. The community amenity contribution does align with our policies, so they've done their calculation related to the amount of square feet of residential area, and so the total value of the critical amenities is $1.3 million. 300,000 of that is proposed to be half of the value of the Loggers Lane and Centennial Way intersection. The other half of that value they're proposing as an additional CAC, just in light of the scale of this rezoning. So the cash in lieu to address, this is an item that we have brought forward previously, was the 350,000 value to offset the loss of campground use on this parcel. And so the change that the applicant is bringing forward is just that's cash dedicated, and council can direct where that would go, whether it would be to critical amenities or somewhere else. And then the remaining cash for critical amenities, $655,000. The value for the active transportation and parks aligns with our CAC policy also, $372,000. That includes $100,000 for a dike pavilion for the Mamcram River Dike, a signalized pedestrian crossing of Centennial Way at $30,000, and a bus stop and shelter on Loggers Lane for $50,000, and remaining cash for active transportation and parks, $190,000. So that totals $162,000 plus the 24 affordable units. In addition to that, as mentioned, there's the other half of the Loggers and Centennial intersection upgrade for $300,000. A public art value at $111,500. As mentioned, there is quite an active transportation component that would have public right-of-ways over them for public use. And on top of that, there's the purpose-built rental apartments, the purpose-built childcare facility, and public access right-of-ways to the development's open space and trails. So that results in a value of $2.27 million plus 24 affordable units. I'll just go over the changes that the proponent has made since this was brought forward for second reading in June. So we've reviewed the community amenity contribution, and so council can direct how that CAC money is spent. Project phasing, I have a plan here which I will review that shows how the proponent proposes to phase the project. At second reading, there were a number of dike-related questions for clarification. I'll speak to that, and then we've got David if there's more questions. The acoustical testing, there was questions from council around the timing that the testing was done. It was done mid-week. So the proponent has done additional testing on a September weekend, so a Saturday and a Sunday. They also did consultation with the Squamish Valley Rod and Gun Club, who in the past have done their own targeted and testing. So those two test results were brought into the acoustical engineer's study, and those results were seen to be similar to the ones that had been done before. So the industrial zoning, there were comments from council at the second reading related to which light industrial uses would be permitted in the light industrial area of this proposal. There was concerns not wanting the lease or owning costs to be increased for units if sort of less light industrial uses were permitted, and the value sort of wouldn't allow light industrial uses to occur there. Also part of that discussion was potential building code renovation costs for adjacent uses such as restaurant and other light industrial uses. And there was also discussion of cannabis production dispensary use here. So at that discussion, and I'll review in another slide, the this rezoning, comprehensive development zone, includes the definition of light industrial. Our I-1 light industrial zone also has the light industrial defined use, but it, in addition to that, has additional uses such as fitness centers and other uses that are not included in this bylaw. There was a comment with council wondering if there could be additional like light industrial employment density, and there was a discussion that parking is a limiting factor with that. Rationale to include alcoholic beverage manufacturing, that use can be removed if council desires. From a community planning perspective, there is a strong rationale to include that there because it is close to residential use and it creates a vibrant neighborhood hub if there is a tasting element there. And then the cannabis production and dispensary uses are not permitted due to distancing requirements with residential use and Brennan Park. The car share provision, so that was a concern and that can be removed from the zone. But the revision that's being brought forward today is limiting that car share provision to one car. So rather, before it had been that if they brought in a car share that was managed by a professional car share company, that the 5 parking stalls could be removed in exchange for that one car share, which is a typical element in Vancouver and other places. And so what's been changed is it's been limited just to one, so they can do that once, and then that's it. And there's rationale for a car share provision in this area because it is so central and close to Brennan Park. The affordable housing units, I already reviewed that. So council's comment at second reading was wondering if there could be townhomes that could be secured as affordable housing. The proponent has increased the ratio of 3-bedroom units to the 1 and 2 bedroom units in response to that. So preference for roundabout over 4-way stop at Centennial and Loggers, there was discussion there around sort of pedestrian and cyclist safety, and Laura Pinsick will be able to speak to that more, but we actually, and I have a slide that I'll speak to that more in a little bit. The applicant has consulted with the industrial users of the truck route. They had previously with Cardinal Concrete, and they did more recently with Lafarge since the second reading. So Lafarge's concerns primarily relate to pedestrian use of that area, which is being mitigated with a signalized pedestrian crossing of Centennial Way, but Lafarge is still concerned that people might be tempted to cross at other locations than that. But in terms of a 4-way stop versus a roundabout, they're amenable to either, so long as it's engineered properly. If it's a roundabout, they'd like potentially a rollover curb style that would allow easy truck access. The corridor trail design of vicinity intersection, there was discussion whether there could be a concrete sidewalk twinning the multi-use path. The answer is yes, and then that would taper to the corridor trail multi-use path away from the intersection. So parking on Centennial Way was discussed at second reading. Parking is not recommended because it is a truck route, but it could be accommodated if there is a strong concern of overflow parking from this development, potentially impacting Brennan Park. In terms of the daycare drop-off, there was concern that the daycare traffic in the previous site design would impact the residential townhomes area of the proposal. So that has been addressed with the proponent doing a site redesign of the daycare to allow for a drop-off. And then a geotechnical report that came up as a question, and it was submitted and provided as an attachment to the staff report. This slide shows us the proposal's phasing. So the proposed phasing, site 1, so the north This is the north side of the south site. So the light industrial building, the purpose-built rental building, the purpose-built daycare, and the office use. This would be phase 1. So that includes the affordable housing. Phase 2 would be the north side of Centennial Way. So that's the mixed use development with the commercial at grade, office, apartments, and townhomes. With phase 2, the proponent would reconstruct the Loggers Lane intersection. They would install the signalized pedestrian crossing on Centennial Way. They would construct the dike pavilion on the Mampcram River dike area and the bus stop on Loggers Lane. Also the public art component. Phase 3 would be the south side of Centennial, the 75 townhomes, and that would also, each phase would include the sort of relevant portion of the community amenity contribution cash, as well as the public right-of-ways for use of open space and trails. So this slide and the next, actually I'll just go to the next. So this one shows that this zone that we're creating, this comprehensive development zone, has this light industrial defined use, and that's what it is on the screen there. It's a very general light industrial use. We are also including the alcoholic beverage manufacturing, which council can remove if there are concerns with that. And in contrast, this is our light industrial zone, our I1 zone, which has that light industrial defined use, but it's amongst a list of other uses that would not be permitted in this zone. This slide summarizes a bit related to employment space. So just comparing some of our employment zones in Squamish. So our downtown C4 zone requires a minimum of 20% employment space, but there are incentives for development to provide additional employment space with an allowance for additional density permitted, whether the building provides 25, 30, or 100% employment. MUD 1 and MUD 2 both, as they sort of have minimum 50% employment space, but again, there are incentives that you can reduce that amount and increase the residential component for elements such as 30% purpose-built rental. And there's also in MUD 2 a provision for public open space. And then Centennial Way, this application is proposing 23% employment space. So this is the flood hazard. I'll summarize this. So these were the questions that came up when we were at second reading. Is the dike built to 1 to 200 or 1 to 500? It does exceed the 1 to 500 level in this location, so it exceeds the standard in our bylaw. It is higher and wider than a super dike standard. Inspector of Dikes review, this has been an ongoing element of this application, and since we've been to council in June with the second reading, the Inspector of Dikes has provided a Dike Maintenance Act approval. The Dike Pavilion, so that's that pavilion, that has been changed slightly since second reading. It was just, before it was on the front side of the dike, it's been moved farther away to allow for maintenance, and that position will also probably change and be refined at a development permit stage. So public parking in the dike area, currently people do park there publicly. The preference is to keep the dike free of infrastructure and obstructions for maintenance, but some public parking may be possible if there, again, are concerns of sort of public access to the dike or overflow parking from this development. Dike stat right-of-way agreements. So this was a topic that we were discussed at second reading, was that the district will typically do maintenance on our dikes and return it to our typical dike standards, whereas this proposal does propose some built elements in that dike right-of-way there's a paved emergency access road, there's a child's open area. And so the way that that would be dealt with is with a stat right-of-way agreement on title that puts the onus on the strata to basically put that top layer back into a manicured state in the event that we need to do some dike maintenance that would impact it in the future. And then since second reading, the applicant has provided some drawings that more clearly show the extent of the dike, sort of the top and toe of the dike and the setbacks and all of that. So I have some of those for discussion if we need them. Another item, so a roundabout versus a four-way stop at Centennial Way. Our municipal engineering department, as well as the applicant's consulting engineer, propose a roundabout for active transportation safety reasons. It does prioritize active transportation and safety in that as vehicles approach a roundabout, the pedestrians are more in front of their line of sight, whereas at a four-way stop, they're more in peripheral vision to the side. There's also lesser lanes to travel. So with a four-way stop that would accommodate truck traffic, it would need chamfered edges and potentially pork chop traffic islands that are difficult for bikes and bikes with trailers to negotiate, and creates additional road crossings. And this slide speaks to the same thing. Basically, yeah, roundabouts do slow down the traffic and are considered to be safer. If council is concerned about the active transportation safety of that intersection, one possibility would be to put in some signalized pedestrian lights on two of the roads so that we have a continuous corridor trail safe route. So this last part of the presentation sort of raises up to some higher level items. We've got the budget, so the Loggers Lane and Centennial intersection cost would be borne by the applicant. It's not a DCC project and it's not in our capital plan. In terms of organizational impact, there is engineering and operations staff that would be involved in further review of this application, and then future maintenance of some of those active transportation routes. The strata would be responsible for some others. So policy, this rezoning is aligned with our objectives of mixed commercial and residential use, active transportation and smart growth principles, employment space. It is designated in our OCP as a neighborhood node. So our policy for that, I will actually go over that on the next slide. And the one element that does not align with our policy is that this land is currently zoned for campground use, so we would lose that land use. So this is the OCP policy related to neighborhood nodes. I'll point out that the policy highlights assessing proposals for neighborhood commercial development in proximity to a neighborhood node against compliance with the following criteria. So location near key intersections, adjacent to other neighborhood amenities such as parks, transit connectivity, and encouraging mixed-use developments, and this proposal does align with those elements. Yeah, so it's got a mix of uses in close proximity to Brennan Park. The housing density and mix of uses will contribute to a walkable, bikeable community. It will add need and benefit to transit services, as this is on the core transit network. It locates multiple uses and services, which helps in reducing GHGs and reducing the need for vehicle travel. The purpose-built rental apartment building adds to employee housing availability. So the staff recommendation this morning is that staff bring this rezoning bylaw application to a regular council meeting for consideration of second reading. Thank you.
Thank you. You can take a breath now. Council. No question? Councillor Anderson.
This may be a question that might have been addressed during other developments that have been addressed by the previous council, and that is safe routes to school, and I think in particular the high school. Has there been any consideration with respect to this or previous developments to routes to the high school? That is, right now, the route that would be indicated on a map is under the Malcolm Blind Channel Bridge. But as we all know, we have a downtown entrance study underway, and there has from time to time been consideration of an overpass or other solutions that we're looking for pedestrian movements from also Loggers Lane to the high school. So I wondered, there are a couple of places where schools are mentioned, but not that issue of access or route to the high school. And whether that might be a consideration for this development. That is, if we are going to build something, there may be some consideration. So I'll just start out with that question as to consideration of safe route to the high school in particular. Safe, convenient route.
Right, through the chair, yeah, certainly safe routes to school is a critical element in our community, and an overpass over the highway has been discussed. That has not been discussed as part of this development proposal. Yeah, it has not been part of this discussion.
I can add to that through the chair. There is, I mean, as you know, there's an underpass that goes under the highway, Highway 99, right at Centennial, and then the Discovery Trail. We are currently making improvements to the Discovery Trail and have more planned for next year. So that trail that follows Highway 99 south to the high school is going to have a lot of improvement to it. So that really will help connect that.
I'll come back to you, Councillor Anderson. Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah. So you mentioned the intersection is not a DCC project. Is there, we just weren't thinking about it, or is there a particular reason why that isn't, or why it might not be in the future, depending on what happens here?
Through the chair. So DCC projects, they need to be identified as major infrastructure projects. It's a little bit gray as to when a project becomes, of a sufficient scale to include it in the DCC bylaw. I know when the previous DCC bylaw was passed, there was extensive discussion with council and looking at comparable DCC rates in other municipalities, and there was some putting in and some trimming out of projects to try and get rates within sort of a reasonable level compared with other municipalities. So there's nothing to say that this project couldn't be in a future DCC bylaw. It just hasn't been identified as to date.
Councillor Anderson.
Thank you. I note that the geotechnical report has been attached, but one of the things I was looking for in that report was a map of the drilling holes. And the reason why I'm interested in that is that during the 1970s and 80s, the general vicinity of this project was a stump dump. And as it turns out, that it's been shown that there aren't any concerns, but there was one particular hole, and while I was interested in a map, is that where was that located? Because for future development in adjacent areas, that might be a consideration as to better having a handle on where that stump dump was. It was referred to as Carney's stump dump because Carney owned a mill, and the district also utilized this as well during land cleaning, and there was a fairly substantial amount of material deposited in that vicinity. So would a map be available should the district be interested in require one in future from this work done?
Through the chair, we could request for one. Yeah.
I would actually suggest that may be of interest,
Okay.
a map of those drill holes, because we have some properties in the vicinity that may see some development in future.
Mr. Olson, I'll go Mr. Olson first, and then I have Mayor Ouellette, Councillor Herbert, and I'll put myself on the list after that. Go ahead, Mr. Olson.
Through the chair, we do have the geotechnical engineers for the proponent here. If you would like additional detail, we could take a short recess and just discuss with them and come back with what level of geotechnical investigation has taken place to date.
If the engineering department is satisfied that the information could be obtained, I wouldn't be requesting that at this time.
Mayor Ouellette, and Councillor Herbert.
So with regard to the light industrial space, are we learning anything from the zoning bylaw rewrite and engagement with folks in the business park about the value or the attractiveness of just doing one floor of light industrial with a mezzanine? People have been speaking, not everybody, but that a higher density type of employment use that allows for light industrial on the bottom floor and more than a mezzanine on the second?
Go ahead.
Through the chair. So the challenge with multi-story industrial is that the costs go up and the utility of the upper floor, we find trouble finding good industrial uses for those upper floors. And at this point, even some of the mezzanine space, sometimes there are associated uses with the industrial activity in the space itself, but sometimes it's hard to find tenants for those spaces. So at this point, I think there's going to be a time in the future where the price of industrial space will warrant the use of upper stories, but for pure industrial, we haven't found a lot of demand for those, especially in discussion with the realtors. They don't identify that that's a heavy demand product, the upper story industrial.
I wasn't necessarily thinking of upper story industrial, but I think of like the C-Link building, which actually has a recording studio above light industrial and, you know, the physio working up there. There's a number of uses, and we've certainly had some interest from other folks to be in one of those three buildings that we've sort of regularized that use. And whether this is another area where we consider a higher density of employment and allow for more of that use on a, so we do the light industrial with mezzanine with a more of an office use above, whether that's office secondary versus primary. I think primary suits better on the north side piece, but yeah, it's my curiosity about whether there is demand for that kind of C-Link building that we see in the business park.
Through the chair, I think this is one of the pieces that we're hoping we'll be able to look forward and see as the population grows what the demand would be for that, and that we're targeting the employment space study that we're working on, but that we haven't gotten to a point where we're getting output from that. We're still getting the inputs for that demand study. So I think that'll be a really useful tool for answering that question in terms of projection and how much demand we'll have for that, but it's not a tool we have yet.
Yeah, I mean, one comment is I don't think 23% employment space is enough, so I'm trying to figure out ways to increase that. Can I ask another question? For the downtown area, when we have 6-story buildings, we're now requiring setbacks along Cleveland. I'm wondering if this zoning includes setbacks for tall buildings in this area as well for upper stories, so that we don't have a massing coming right to the corridor trail or Centennial Way.
Through the chair, yeah, this comprehensive development zone really locks down what we're seeing. These are the heights there. So yeah, we don't have that stepping back that we have downtown. I don't know that it's been considered quite a significant an issue, but I'm hearing you're saying on sort of Loggers Lane, because currently the proposal does step back a ways from Centennial Way. So it's not sort of, I think downtown we've got a concern of allowing sunlight and views in, but yeah, we don't have those same stepping back that we do downtown.
So I realize we're trying to protect the view to Chikai or Mount Garibaldi from downtown, but wouldn't we also want to make sure we're protecting those views from all the way through the corridor?
Through the chair, yes, I think it's just, it hasn't been in that same consideration because we don't have these sort of linear downtown streets here. You know, we do, let's have a look here. So in that middle slide there, this is showing that the townhouse here on Centennial Way is stepping back on that north side. Yeah, I know that on the whole, we're going to see more buildings that have these straight facades due to energy efficiency requirements, but that hasn't arisen as a concern yet on this proposal.
No, well, that's one of my other questions, but I'm wondering if we have given some thought to how these buildings obstruct views to the north.
Through the chair, the view corridors and kind of trying to protect those views of key kind of view assets within Squamish is a fairly new concept for us from our policy perspective. And in our initial incorporation of it into the OCP, I believe it's contained within the downtown guidelines. So I think that was kind of the first test of that, and we're just starting to get our first experiences in looking into that and trying to grapple with how we're going to roll that out. It hasn't been applied to more broadly, and I think that might be an opportunity to consider, but we don't have policy at this point, if I'm correct in my understanding, that would trigger that at this time. So that maybe is something that we need to highlight and contemplate.
Through the chair, I think what we saw in our last DP application is that our universal guidelines actually asked for consideration of views.
Okay.
And then we got into a bit of a discussion with staff because the proponent hadn't provided pictures of that. And so where is the best place to capture that? Is it really in the DP area guidelines, or is it better to capture it in rezoning, which then gives the proponent more certainty as they get to the DP stage with their architect? I think it's in the wrong place.
Yeah. Okay.
I would argue that view corridors should be done at the rezoning phase and not after an architect has spent a lot of time designing a building.
Right.
So I just don't want to get to a point where, you know, if this proceeds and we get DPs, then council's arguing about, well, I actually really wanted to protect that view corridor, and then staff say, well, it wasn't captured in zoning, and these are just DP area guidelines.
And through the chair, to be clear, would it be a matter of wanting the proponent to specifically look at the views and what impact there might be to those views from this proposal?
I'm curious. I think the view is okay, right? If you look up Centennial Way, I think we're fine. It's just that I don't want to get caught again, and I think we have to consider this from different angles. I'll wait.
Okay.
I got more questions.
Councillor Herford, myself, Councillor Penfield, Councillor Anderson.
Chair, I'd like to be put on the list too, please.
Okay. Councillor Plana. Councillor Herford, go ahead.
Thank you. So in your breakdown in the report of the zoning, and I don't think you mentioned it in your presentation today, but the restaurant usage is a no there. That's correct?
That is. I think I have a supporting slide for the uses. Here we are. So these are the uses that are included in this comprehensive development zone. So yeah, there's not restaurant in that list.
And that part of the concern I had last time was when we had the alcoholic beverage production and some of the challenges we're having in other areas of the community with that sort of restaurant use and all the issues that can happen. So I'm happy to see that that's addressed here. Thank you for that clarity. I'm curious about the phasing and to me, the construction phase, despite everyone's best effort, is always sort of a step backwards in sort of traffic flow, and there's always challenges. I was wondering if we get that that intersection addressed earlier in the process. I appreciate that it's an expensive endeavor, but there's even right now, I think it's a bit of a challenge. Can you speak to how we sort of arranged it or arrived at that?
Through the chair, this is the applicant's or the proponent's proposal, so staff would have to go back to the proponent and see if they're able to provide that earlier.
Can I add to that, please, through the chair? In fact, we're working on a realigning of the south portion of Loggers Lane, just south of the Centennial intersection right now. There's stakes in the ground, and it'll be rerouted through Brennan Park parking lot if you go through there over the next week or so. Sorry. And yeah, to actually line up the intersection a little bit better, because we recognize that it's a safety hazard at the moment. You can't even make eye contact with people who are across the way from you because it is so distant. So that at least will be lining up better, and four-way should function a little bit better once that's done. So yeah, it might buy some time.
It's a step in the right direction. I understand that there's all sorts of services to run through, and we don't want to go through and do an intersection 5 times, but I'll leave it there for now.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to go to myself, and then I'm going to go to Councillor Stoner, who hasn't yet asked a question, then Councillor Pettengill, Councillor Anderson. And my question was around the affordable rental units, and we've had, and I'm going back by memory, different examples in previous developments, but could you clarify who might own those units and who might manage those units to ensure their ongoing affordability?
Through the chair, those are great questions. I haven't been top of mind to the work that General Manager Gary Buxton has been doing, but I understand that he's creating an affordable housing policy that will dictate this. I don't know if someone else is able to speak to that more clearly, but I know that he is doing that work.
That'll be an outstanding question then.
Okay, yeah.
And it's also, it's the ownership, and I know, going by memory, in some developments when we covenant them, those units, so that they do have to meet an affordability definition, the developer still might own them, or might sell them as investment units, with obviously a reduced price because limited rental income. But then there's the question of who actually manages that process and who runs the list and so forth. And is it us or the developer, or who should it be? So I'll just leave that for staff to consider. I'll go to Councillor Stoner.
Hi there, thank you, Chair. I will carry on the theme of affordable housing units, and I appreciate the developers' move towards a greater diversity of housing unit types, but I recognize that they're all still within the condo apartment dwelling, and none of them are in the townhouses. And I'm curious, I recognize that our CAC policy doesn't actually necessarily direct to requiring that diversity of housing when a certain percentage of units are required to be affordable, but I'm curious to hear from staff what our levers are if we need to change our policy in that regard to ensure that we're not just creating certain subsets of new communities being affordable while the other subset of the community is not.
Through the chair, yeah, I mean, we can certainly create policy that requires maybe a different breakdown and requires that some are townhomes. I know in terms of this discretionary rezoning proposal, the applicant has identified that this is sort of, there's a lot of different elements that are being included in this proposal, in this development proposal, and so from their point of view, they're not able to provide affordable townhomes, but they were able to provide larger apartment units instead.
Okay, well, I'd like to flag that as something maybe that we consider if and when the time comes when we review our CAC policy. I appreciate that it's maybe a bit behind the times at this point, and there are other things that the developers bring to the table, but it's one thing that I'm cognizant of moving forward. Chair, I do have a second question, but it's on a different topic. Are you okay if I keep going?
Go ahead.
All right, it's on the industrial zoning piece and the non-allowance of a restaurant. And to me, this is kind of a chicken and egg, and I think my question is to Matt Gunn. If we're learning anything through the process that we currently have with the rezoning, or the zoning bylaw review, to me, if it's going to be a neighborhood hub, part of it of like having a neighborhood hub is to have somewhere you can go and have dinner and walk to a restaurant. And we've also heard from the craft beverage manufacturers that it's actually really critical for them to have a restaurant of some sort in order to support their other ventures in terms of craft beverage manufacturing. And so recognizing that that also comes with some challenges that we've experienced in the business park, I'm just curious where we're landing on that through the zoning bylaw review.
Go ahead.
Yeah, through you, Chair. So it's a great question, and not one that's easy to answer, but I can tell you where we're at. So first off, we've done some engagement. We've heard loud and clear, as you say, that for example, craft beverage manufacturers really want to have these as part of their businesses. So there are industrial users that really benefit, particularly at the startup stage, from having that kind of opportunity to engage their customers through a restaurant. But we have also heard that there are impacts from having that level of visitation into industrial areas, and through some of the zoning bylaw update engagement, we've heard businesses that have said that there becomes problems with that level of traffic in the area. And so our goal through the zoning bylaw update right now is to complete the employment land or employment space demand analysis and get a sense of how much land we feel is appropriate to have for a pure light industrial that doesn't have that kind of commercial aspect, and then look for the opportunities to land a zone like the I-1, traditional I-1, which had the industrial and that ability for restaurant in the park. I think ultimately we need space for both, and what we want to do is use this demand study to try and articulate what proportion of our employment land should be used for land uses that don't have that commercial aspect. That isn't done at this point, and so it's hard to give direction on this particular project and how that relates to this project. But ultimately we are going to want to have places that have that mix, that do allow somebody to start a business and sell that product on site, potentially to a large number of people. There's certainly demand from people like the brewers who would like to have fairly large restaurants. In discussion with a number of them, there's interest and a feeling that they could support up to 100 restaurant seats quite readily, and that would be great for their business. And so it's a matter of where do we want that to go? Is this a place where we'd want to see something like that? Ultimately, I think we are going to have to say there. I think if we want to have a supply of space for all of the potential businesses in the community, we are going to have space where we say that is not a use that should mix with light industrial. But we don't have the numbers right now because that demand supply isn't done to project how much we want and where that's going to be. So how this piece fits into that bigger picture is tough to know from a planning perspective where it should add to the supply. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I realize it's not an easy answer, so thanks for trying to lay it out. I appreciate the detail.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. You're good? So I'll go to Councillor.
Yes, all good.
Okay, Councillor Pettengill, Councillor Anderson, Mayor Elliott, Councillor Herbert.
So two things. My sense is that if we were going to purchase and develop a comparable piece of land in terms of the number of pads, the servicing of the pads, and for camping, and their proximity to services and so on, transit and rec and all of that, it would be a heck of a lot more than $350,000. Is that a fair assumption? And if it is, how are we reconciling that against the offer of $350,000 for displacing that? we're losing that?
Through the chair, that $353,000 value arose early in this application process. It was seen that the nearby Mamquam River Access Society campground was providing camping in a central location in the district, and there was a desire to support that existing just to support, somebody's already doing it, can we provide them water service? Through this application process, what we've heard is that council would rather direct where that money goes. In terms of whether that value would buy land for the district to develop our own campground. Land in Squamish is extremely expensive, so I don't know that that's that wouldn't work.
And just for clarity, I did see that in the report about the thoughts about redirecting it. That was not my personal concern. My personal concern is losing what seems to be a very limited and important asset at this point. And how do we have enough funds if we don't do it there to do something comparable somewhere else? And I'm not sure we've hit the mark there. The other piece, I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about how we've reorganized some of the parking and traffic on site. There's a few things I didn't quite recall from our discussion. So my recollection wasn't that I was interested in seeing fewer car shares. I think maybe the discussion was about not enough parking, but I don't know that for me a reduction of car share spots is necessarily the right thing there. And then I also noticed the daycare roundabout, we seem to have lost green space and what looks like could have been trees for shading and so on. And so I'm wondering, it made me think about, so where are we expecting the kids to play? Do they have to cross streets now and so on? And I understand that, the specific site design is not final at this point, but I'm just wondering if you can speak to that. Are we doing the right trade-offs in terms of dealing with the access to daycare and green space and shading and, car shares and electric car charging and that sort of thing, thinking to the future?
Through the chair, yes, definitely. Staff also noticed that there was a bit of a trade-off. That is a challenge with developing a comprehensive development zone, is that on the one level we're looking at land use and what's the right mix of land use to secure in zoning, but we've got development permit level detail of site planning when we're not sure that the rezoning will go forward. So like you said, this is sort of a site detail that will definitely be worked out if this proceeds to a development permit stage. In terms of the car share, I know that this application is meeting our zoning bylaw parking requirements and going above and beyond. The tandem residential units all have 2 stalls that's internal in a garage, as well as a full-length driveway outside, so there's additional parking there. What staff heard with the car share provision, I think was some concern that when a car share is provided, it does reduce by 5 stalls the amount of parking on site, and that perhaps that might create a parking shortage. But if council wanted to clarify that point, that'd be good.
Just for my own fun, I can understand concern about losing parking. I'm not sure the only solution is to reduce car share spots, and I'm not sure for me that's the solution I'm comfortable with necessarily, although we may be restricted by existing policy.
So I'll just say to council, this is kind of a question period, but there will be a moment for comments. And if you have comments such as that, absolutely, that'll be the time. At the time we're talking about a resolution. So I have Councillor Anderson. Oh, go ahead, Mr. Gunn.
Is it possible to add one point to your question about campground? I've had some interesting, as part of the zoning bylaw update, we've been looking at some of the definitions in campgrounds. So I've had a bunch of interactions with the campground operators in the last while. And one of the interesting pieces in Squamish with camping is that the product that was available on this site previously, there's a large demand for a certain type of camping in the community, but that particular product, although this campground I think was quite successful, some of the other campgrounds in the area that offered a similar product, RVs, pull-up, hook up to services, and hang out, they were only full on very few numbers of occasions through the summer. And in fact, the closure of this campground had led to kind of for the first time one of the campground operators said the first time they actually were getting close to capacity on a more regular basis. It seems to me that this product, RVs pulling in and hanging out for a period of time, the demand is only high on the weekends through the summer, and it's this more transient, lower cost camping that we see a ton of demand for kind of continually. So I think there's a bit of a mix of products and mix of demand levels for it, and I think this product is served in the community in other commercial campgrounds.
Thank you. Go to Councillor Anderson, Mayor Elliott, Councillor Herford.
Yes, on the topic of the community and amenity contribution, I'll just read a line from the staff report. If council wishes CAC to be spent on salmon spawning channels, council can direct cash toward this purpose. The people that can offer advice on this is Department of Fisheries and Oceans, in particular Mr. Dave Nansen, who would be happy to advise on this. Those spawning channels further up the road on Centennial, we are about 35 years old, and we see, I'm a Squamish streamkeeper, that some of the spawning channels do require maintenance and upgrades over time, and we can anticipate that. My question is it possible, or is there precedent for directing that money to such a project elsewhere, not in the vicinity, because there can be readily identifiable projects for spawning habitat elsewhere. Would this be a practice? Is there a precedent for this, directing CAC money to another part of the district for such a similar project?
Through the chair, I believe it would be up to council to direct where the money goes, and I don't think that it would be an issue if it's elsewhere.
I see. I suggest that there may be another area that maybe have less opportunity to obtain money through developer contributions. That can be something we can address in future. A related question is the water supply for the campground that we've been discussing further up the road. I would be interested to have, perhaps there has been a fuller discussion of the options for supplying potable water to that campground and indeed to the neighboring Rod and Gun Club facility. What are the technical options? Is there a delivery system that could be implemented that would be cheaper than the cost of putting a pipe under the road? I would be interested in future to have a fuller discussion of that issue. I have just a brief observation on the industrial land and the truck route, and this relates to...
Well, let me just, if it's a question, go ahead, but if it's a comment,
yes,
it is time for comment.
Thank you. It is a comment. I'll see it for later.
Just to go back to clarifying the question of the water supply, I guess the question would be, if this development goes ahead more or less as we see it here, does that provide sufficient flow to be able to attach other users at the end of it?
Through the chair, my understanding is that if water service was able to be brought to the campground, I think probably the Rod and Gun could also use it, but I think there's really three options with the water. The first is not possible from BCH perspective, which is a low cost sort of a well or something else. From a health perspective, that's not possible. The second option is putting a pressurized water service through the dike, and so that's something that would need to be discussed more with David Rolston. I know that that's not a best practice and we don't want to put pressurized water service through our dikes. I don't know whether this one can be smaller or up high, and if there's a way around that concern. Another one that Councillor Anderson raised, staff has also considered but not sure what the solution is yeah, maybe there's a way of providing a water service that's some distance away from the campground. So, you know, a faucet that's on the land side of the dike, so it doesn't have to cross the dike. I don't know if that would be useful for the campground if they had to sort of fill up a water source. So yeah, that could be explored further. And I don't know if David wants to speak to it.
Just one thing to add to that is that Vancouver Coastal Health, we've had some discussions about servicing the campground in the past, and they have encouraged the district that if they are to have a water service, their preference is that it be served by the district's main water system, because it's fully regulated. We have a full team of operators who are ensuring the quality of water supply, as opposed to some sort of on-site type of water system. So I think that is the preference. In terms of putting the pipe down Centennial, which is also the dike, it can be done. As Elaine said, it's not a best practice, because if there's a water main failure, that can then impact the integrity of the dike. There may be design solutions around that. We do have cases where we do have pressurized infrastructure within dikes. It just requires special consideration. So that's something we would look at if directed to, and during the detailed design process.
Thank you. Mayor Elliott, Councillor Harvie.
Just the pavilion that's proposed is like $100,000 value, I think, and why? And why would it have a bike hub? We have one at Brennan Park, so that seems redundant. And why does it look paved? And why does staff feel that it needs to be this sort of type of manicured structure versus just a shelter?
Through the chair, early in this presentation is an image of the proposed pavilion as it stands. And so this is what has been proposed is a structure that is more robust and larger than maybe some of our other sort of kiosks at trailheads. And the intention with this was to provide a real hub for that active transportation community, recognizing that this proposal is located on the Mampquam River Dike.
Can you point out where that might be? I'm having trouble seeing where that might be located.
Yeah, maybe I'll go back to the other drawings. It's sort of where this letter G is, roughly in this area.
Okay. Thank
Yeah. It would be sort of in this zone. But yeah, the thought was to make it a focal point for the larger community. It could be pared down, and that value could be put towards a different element of the CAC.
Something to consider. Where do we capture our 5-for-1 car share policy? Where is that captured?
It's captured in the CD zone. So in the CD,
We don't have overarching policy that we would trade 5.
through the chair, this we brought from our waterfront landing development zone. It has that provision in it, and so we brought it forward. It wasn't something that the proponent did, it was something that staff suggested.
But to Councillor Pettengill's question, we do not have overarching policy. We've done this in specific zones. We don't have an overarching policy for this. So I want to clarify that we actually have discretion here. To Councillor Pettengill's question, this is not captured anywhere as a specific policy. This is being done right now on a one-off basis at rezoning. So we absolutely have discretion to figure out how many car share spots. So one thing we know in our conversations with Modo was that they don't like having one car because consumers want choice. If one car is booked, they need another option. So one is not enough. And then I think it's up for council to decide whether you want to trade parking spots for that, or whether we just start to expect that big developments that add density put in car share without necessarily having to trade off guest parking or resident parking. So I know that's a big city thing, But I don't necessarily think that has to be a Squamish thing, given that we're not laying this out anywhere in our zoning bylaw or our CEC policy out there. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear for my colleague. To Councillor Stoner's point, and this is a point that I was also considering the last time we talked about this, is that, you know, if I read over Councillor French's shoulder, increase the number of affordable housing form options, from cottages to detached homes to townhouses to apartments, size and the numbers of bedrooms within each form year over year by 2022. So my question is, why wouldn't we, when we captured cottages and lock-off suites in the Garibaldi Springs rezoning, why wouldn't we capture different forms in this development? This is a huge development.
Through the chair, for clarification, do you mean affordable units or
Yeah,
units?
that's what it says. Increase the number of affordable housing form options year over year.
Through the chair, this proposal does have some lock-off suites and it has the townhomes and the apartments, so it has a variety of residential forms. But the affordable units that this applicant is able to provide in consideration of the mix of the rest of the CEC and everything else is the apartment units.
But I guess, why not a triplex on a portion of the townhome site, so that there's ground oriented but a different form, looks like a single family home but multiple families can live in it. So not everyone wants to live in an apartment, not everyone can afford a townhome. So what are other housing forms that will work given the floodplain here? I just want that to be considered, because we get apartments, and that's what our community who needs affordable housing, those are basically their options. And it's not fair, especially when we've got like a huge piece of land like this. We need to start to figure out, even if it's one. So I think, you know, I want to emphasize what Councillor Stoner was trying to get across. It doesn't need to be captured in policy. We have discretion here, and it's been clearly in our strategic plan since the beginning of our term that we want to see more forms of affordable housing for our residences. And that's going to be a challenge, and I don't necessarily have the answer for that, but I think we have to keep pushing for that. Can I keep going, or you want me to switch off?
One more.
Okay. Just on the roundabout, which is fine, we kind of have 5 entrances. There's that sort of side entrance down to the baseball fields. How does that get into this mix? How do we realign that portion? Because there's sort of a de facto merge that happens coming out of Brennan Park, and then you enter the intersection.
Through the chair, yeah. So essentially what happens is there are those 2 other entrances that, I mean, a lot of the existing problem with the Centennial intersection is that it's just like a giant patch of asphalt that nobody can figure out where to go in. So what we would do is formalize those 2 entrances from Brennan Park, like as in get them at right angles to the road, a proper stop bar, a stop sign for both of those. So those would continue to be a single stop sign coming on to Centennial, and then, or I mean, we could look at a different option as well. But in my mind, this is the simplest way to handle it. And then they're a little further back from the roundabout, so they're not getting into that mix and making it more confusing. So we'll definitely have to look at in much more detail as this goes along, and I suspect it's going to take us a little while to arrive on the perfect solution for this one, because it's, yeah, but we have a lot of space to work with. That's the good news.
Councillor Harvie.
Thank you. On the image on page 21 of 93 shows the sort of the layout and more detailed usage. So I'm just pulling it up myself. And there it says coffee shop patio on the north, that north unit, in the northeast corner of Centennial Way. So yeah, outside the blue, although it's not labeled, I see it there. So, but when I look at the chart that went back to the accepted use, it didn't say anything about cafe. So is that considered neighborhood commercial or retail sales, or what definition is the cafe? And I'm just thinking cafe restaurant, and I don't really see that. anywhere else but this coffee shop patio designation here.
It's neighborhood commercial. Through the chair, and neighborhood commercial would certainly include a cafe.
Right, and then that, so neighborhood commercial, and that's only that north side. Okay, and then, can I keep?
Go ahead.
The car share parking, I just chime in on that. I appreciate the car share and the need for car share going forward as to be a viable option. It should be more than one. I'm not but to make that transition not too difficult, I think 5 spots is too many if we're doing math that way. To give up 5 spots for one car share, I think it's going to create too much parking pressure on the site. So I don't know what the right ratio is, but I don't think we have that quite right. I would like to see more car share, but I don't want to see, if we had 3 car share spots, I don't want to see us losing 15 parking spots. I don't think that's quite right. But I agree with Mayor Elliott that we need to be moving in a direction where it's provided, and I'm happy that there's a ratio. I just think that's too aggressive a ratio. And we haven't touched on the parking on Centennial Way, and the potential for parking at what, as Mayor Elliott points out, is quite a potentially glorious piece of architecture up on the northeast corner, like on top of the dike. There's some potential parking to access that, and I don't know if anyone else wants to hear about parking on Centennial Way. I'm happy if there's none, just to be clear with the discussion. But I'm thinking that maybe some parking up over there would be good to help public access this amenity and the view on top of the dike. It's sort of where I'm falling on the parking piece, so that's captured. And I understand having the top of dikes sort of easy to access in case of emergency and for ongoing maintenance, that sort of thing. I wouldn't think there'd be a lot of infrastructure with the parking. Even a gravel pullout off the side would be a spot. I think it's going to be a spot people are going to want to go to, and they're going to be with the enforcement issues just if it's not provided.
Councillor Pettengill, and then I'm mindful of time. We've gone over our time, but I wanted to have a fulsome discussion here. And fortunately, for this discussion, one of the other agenda items got dropped off, so we do have a little bit more flexibility. But I'm still thinking that we want to kind of get to final questions, and then I want to provide a little bit of time for comment. And what I would propose doing, and you can think about it, is moving a resolution, either the one recommended or another resolution, and then having the comments as part of the debate on that resolution. So I'll go to Councillor Pettengill, and I don't have anybody else in the speaker list at the moment. Councillor Pettengill.
Okay. So thank you, Chair. Mr. Gunn, I just want to dig into some of your comments. When I walk around town, we have different populations and demographics in terms of camping need. It seems to me there are a significant number of these sort of large Mercedes camper conversion vans, and relative to sleeping in your Corolla, they seem fairly luxurious and well appointed. And so to my mind, I think a lot of those are not always parking in a designated camping area. And in my mind, that's exactly the sort of vehicle you might expect at the site that's there now. Just test if that is sort of a reasonable thought on my part.
Yeah, through you, Chair. I think, I should just clarify, I think there's, from talking to the campground operators, on the weekends, the demand is high for sure, but it seems to be just a limited number of days, those weekends and holidays. And then the rest of the days, they're not nearly as full. And I think you're right, when you look at those fairly nice and, you know, not inexpensive vans that people are in and coming to town in, they seem like they would be the right vehicle to pull in and pay for those spots. And I think what may be happening, this is just my perception from the conversations that I've had, but I think some of the people who are purchasing those vehicles are doing it because they have this feeling that they'll then be able to go places and camp inexpensively or free, and then enjoy the recreational activities they're involved in. And there seems to be some level of barrier in their perception to paying for some of those more expensive spots. Not that $40 is unreasonable or even kind of that range for campgrounds, but from talking to the campground operators, they seem to get a lot of pushback on paying that price, and often those people are looking for those free spots. I think there's a bit of disconnect between expectations and what's possible to provide for campground operators. So I think ideally those vehicles would wind up in the campgrounds. It just seems sometimes there's a reluctance to do so. This is just my impression from discussions.
So, you know, maybe I'll come back to that piece in my comments. The other piece then, sort of regardless of whether or not that specific type of vehicle belongs there now, with the current zoning, I take it that whoever operates that in some sort of camping capacity could do it anything from tents to even a trailer that you unhitch for a while. And right now we have that sort of range of housing and or camping capacity, which we would lose with this rezoning. Is that?
Yeah, through the chair. You're absolutely correct. A campground could have a huge range of, you know, from very basic campground or tent up to a fancy RV, absolutely. And, you know, for people that are living in vehicles, that may be some opportunity for some part of our housing spectrum. So losing those spaces for sure removes spaces where, you know, we may have people able to camp. I think I was just trying to highlight that what I had heard from the campground operators was that they weren't full through the summer. I just thought that was a contextual piece.
Okay. Mary Elliott.
So we have a number of people leasing from us on the old forestry building land. And that land, from what I understand, we're just doing short-term leases so that we have more flexibility for our real estate facilities master plan process. So could we not look at securing space for SAR and the forestry and whoever else is leasing on that land in next door? So we know having Flinro here is vitally important to our community.
Through the chair, we could explore that with the proponent.
So it creates more certainty for those who are looking to lease long-term from us, which we can't provide at this point. But you know, I also don't want to lose Flinro. It's really, in the same way we didn't want to lose the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, it's really important to the corridor to have those professionals working here. So if there's a way to contemplate keeping them in the neighborhood, that would be great.
Through you, Chair, I feel like I owe one more piece of information to your earlier question about second story. One thing we've heard endlessly is that there is definitely demand for professional spaces. For example, like an office or a particular healthcare professionals, that sort of stuff. And those second stories could potentially work for those. There's a lot of demand for that. I think my response was based in this current consideration of whether or not we want to have those office spaces in industrial land. There's this idea about, do we want to separate, do we want to drive them downtown? But if this was a spot where we wanted to see those types of professionals, then there definitely is demand there. The realtors express that there's lots of people looking for those spaces, which is they're often looking in the business park. We've just been having this struggle right now about, do we want to land them in business park or do we want to drive towards our major commercial nodes? But that demand is high, and so there is certainly demand for that.
I could make a comment about that, but Councillor Rice is keeping us to questions right now. So this whole piece about what I'm learning through the zoning bylaw and talking to Craft Beverage Association is that the restaurant use is actually vitally important to their bottom line, to actually being a going concern. And so what I wonder is with this land, if we didn't create a new use, which is actually the restaurant use with a brewery or a distillery attached. So the primary is restaurant, the secondary use. So we flip this equation, and I mean, it doesn't go in a light industrial building. It's more like a HACCP brew pub kind of idea. But we learn the lesson, which is they kind of need to be a little bit separate, or else they will raise the rent for everybody. But we know they all want at least 50 seats. So why not now use this as an opportunity to look at doing it right?
Can I respond to that? Yeah, I absolutely think that we need to find locations to land that type of business. There's tons of demand, and it doesn't fit downtown because of the amount of space. That right now our downtown spaces aren't really appropriate, which is why they're landing in the business park. So far, the problem has been that we've been trying to do too many different things with the same space in the business park, but finding locations that are appropriate for craft beverage manufacturing. And often they say, actually 100 seats would be usable. And so, yeah, if we want to find a space and say, actually, this is more for that commercialized use that those type of businesses are looking for and not finding in our commercial centers, there is definitely rationale and demand for that. Yeah, and so our current problem to date has been trying to figure out what the appropriate amount and where they should go is, but there's demand for them for sure.
So yeah, that's something that's sitting in the back of my mind is let's not keep doing what we're doing. Maybe let's try something different.
Okay. You good? So I am now looking for a motion.
I'm prepared to move the motion as presented.
Staff recommendation?
Yes.
Moved by Councillor Anderson.
I'd like to propose an amendment to that before we get it seconded,
Go ahead.
which is to bring it back with, for second reading with comments from the Committee of the Whole incorporated.
Let's bring the amendment.
Okay. Is there a seconder for that? Councillor French? Council, who would like to speak to that? Councillor Anderson, it's your motion. You can speak first.
Yes, I'd like to speak generally on the topic.
I'm sorry, let me just, before we go too far in this, keep in mind that at this point, we are not making a final approve or disapprove decision on this development. That happens after the public hearing, and so we're using this opportunity to express concerns or things you want to see more of or positives, but not to indicate any kind of final decision. And there seems to be a discussion. Ms. Arthurs, go ahead.
If I could ask Mr. Gunn or Ms. Naseby to summarize the comments to ensure that we've captured them and that it's complete and that council is actually in agreement with the comments that were heard. Sort of everybody's in agreement versus, well, it's just one person's comment. That would really be helpful in incorporating them into the bylaw, the amended bylaw that's going to be coming back.
Okay. The
Because
comments,
we don't want to be sitting at the meeting
Yeah.
and saying, well, what about this?
no, and the comments haven't quite yet been made. So before we vote, perhaps if you could keep track of the comments that individual councillors make. Before we vote, we'll summarize those.
Oh, that would be great.
And if there is a change, we'll change it at that time before we vote.
So these are the comments coming now.
This is it. I mean, you've got the questions. You might have taken something out of the questions, but this is the comments. Councillor Anderson.
Yes, I'd like to suggest that with respect to the community amenity contributions, that both the spawning channels and the water options issue be explored further, and including the prospect of directing, if it's spawning channels, to elsewhere in the district. I have in mind the Buckley Avenue culvert and Wilson Crescent Slough as an example, just a scenario of directing investment, because there isn't a lot of options for that area from neighboring developments, given their nature. Secondly, I'd like to comment generally on the employment land strategy reference in the staff report. It states that the employment land strategy highlights the need for employment and industrial lands in Squamish, a general statement. However, what the employment land strategy highlighted was the lack and scarcity of medium industrial lands. And I think that it would be helpful that we keep that bigger picture, and that here, in consideration of Centennial Way neighborhood, that the bigger picture is the future supply and use of and truck access for medium industrial uses east of this project. And that I would be concerned if we might see influences from this project that would constrain those medium industrial uses in future. With respect to the intersection, I'm satisfied that the engineering department has determined that the pedestrian and cyclist safety issues can be addressed in a roundabout solution. This is what I gather from the staff report. The roundabout solution certainly would appear to be preferable from a trucking point of view, and I believe that what we will see in future is more large truck uses, not only with the quarry and the cement business, but other businesses that will migrate to this area in future because there simply aren't other areas to migrate to. And there is vacant or underutilized land at least east of the project. So I'll leave my comments at that. And in summary, I do not have concerns about the use of industrial land in this project, other than that I hope it can work for the project, and that includes parking demand that may result from it.
Thank you. I have Councillor French, Councillor Herbert, and I'll put myself on the list. Councillor Pennington. Councillor Stoner, do you want to be on the list?
Yes, please, Chair.
I'll put you in there somewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you. So generally, I'm quite pleased with what's come back to us. On the roundabout or four-way stop issue, I definitely support the roundabout. There's one very close to my house, and that traffic circle works well. And I think does a great job of protecting pedestrians and cyclists while also keeping traffic moving, which is an environmental benefit. I would support an increase to the car share spaces. Also, I'm comfortable with salmon habitat spawning CAC being spent elsewhere in the community, away from this particular project. And the community amendment contribution for displacing the camping, well, that figure seems a little low. I think that I can live with that figure. And then, just a side note that maybe doesn't necessarily directly impact the mayor's comments about more diverse housing forms. I think that's a point well taken that we need to take into consideration for future proposals coming to us. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have Councillor Pettengill, Hereford, Mayor Elliott, Councillor Stoner, and then myself. Councillor Pettengill.
So I was gonna, I was thinking about proposing that we just send this back to staff, but I will support this for second reading with consideration of the comments. I am concerned that we're losing too much in potential camping capacity in some form, and so I think we need, from my perspective, to have some sort of plan to recoup what we're losing. It doesn't have to be camping there necessarily, but I think we need to find a way forward that there's just too much of an issue with a lack of camping to give that up for what's offered here, in my mind. I think we do need more car share spots, and I'm not sure 5-to-1 trade is reasonable. And what was the other? Yeah, the lack of employment space relative to some of the other zones is a bit of a concern, I think, especially as we want people to not commute and so on. We do have to think very carefully about what sort of employment options we are providing, at least in terms of infrastructure in Squamish.
Thank you. Councillor Herbert.
Thank you. I got a bit of a list here. Happy to see the evolution from when we saw this last, and some of the questions and the pending issues have been addressed, like we didn't have diking approval or approval from the Diking Authority, I believe, last time, and a few other things. So I'm happy to see this process to continue to unfold. I would like to see, I mentioned earlier the car share. I'd love to see more than one spot, but I don't think that our 5-spot trade-off is appropriate. So somewhere, I don't know what the right number is, but I feel like 5 is too many, or maybe we just require 3 spots, period, and add that to the parking requirement. I asked some questions earlier around the current status of restaurant use. I'm not opposed to having restaurant in this area or in this development, but I want to make sure that we, if that is going to be a permitted use, that we've planned accordingly for the parking and the flow of customers in and out of that, and how that will affect the other pieces. So I feel that if that was to be introduced at this point, it would most likely change the layout, given what I suspect to be the appropriate parking requirements for that. But I'm not opposed to that use being there. The phasing, if we can get that intersection safer sooner, and I understand there's work underway potentially tomorrow on some pieces of that, but if that can be moved around in the phasing, that would be great. I believe that the experts with saying the roundabout's the way to go. I'm all on board with that. I do think that crossing controls for corridor trail is important to make sure that our active transportation flows through there easily, and we don't create another sort of crux point. I believe a little bit of parking on top of the dike on would that be the northeast portion there, up on top of the dike by the proposed structure would be a good idea, and it might help us in a little bit of site overflow as well. And I agree with the no parking on Centennial Way. And the mix of forms with the rentals, affordable or otherwise, I'd like to see that. I appreciate the shift from where we were, so we have some more bedrooms at this point, but I agree with the other comments that that can be a more diverse mix there. And my last piece, I think, would be if there was opportunity for our tenants, whether it's SAR or Flinrow, to tenant some of these spaces, and maybe even build according to whatever their specific requirements would be. I think it would be a huge potential. So that would carry some weight with me. But in general, I'm happy to support more work on this project. I think we're moving in the right direction, and appreciate the work done today. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary Elliott.
Okay, I really actually like the Site 1 portion of this. I didn't have any comments or questions about it. I think it's a good use of that space. I appreciate keeping the tree buffer. But one thing for both sites that I'll reiterate is I do think we should contemplate views. You know, one of the things that we're trying to do is make sure that people have access to sort of a place that feels wild. It doesn't really matter what neighborhood they're in. So I think building buildings that would cut off views in this neighborhood as people come up the corridor trail would be a detriment. And related to that is my comment that I don't think we should over manicure this. So people want to walk along the dike. I actually don't think that they want cement. And I do think they want picnic tables, and I do think they want a place to get out of the sun or get out of the rain. But I think we keep that sort of very manicured look for our Mem-Combine channel and around the ocean front. But out in our neighborhoods, I don't think this is what our community wants. I think they want to be connected to nature and feel gravel under their feet and walk the dogs. You know, so I think we have to be very careful about what this dike ends up looking like. And I realize a lot of that will be captured at the DP stage, but I also think there's a lot of money being put behind that pavilion that maybe could go elsewhere. So I just want to maybe get council and then the proponent thinking about that. My questions about employment, I do think there's an opportunity to see more employment here. This is a mixed-use employment area. So in my brain, employment is the strongest word in that mixed-use zone. So the 23% is certainly not high enough for me. I said this earlier that we need at least 2 car shares. I always think that parking's a bit of a red herring. I think if the proponent believes it's marketable to give up 5 parking spots for 2 car shares, why not? We're putting people in a walkable neighborhood with employment on a bus route and the corridor trail. I mean, there's probably not a better site to actually be a 1-car family. So, and if we're looking at apartment uses, I don't necessarily think people will always have 2 cars going forward, and I think with the affordability in our community, it starts to make sense. So I'm not opposed to seeing the 5-to-1 trade-off, but there should be at least 2 cars in that area. And I'd be okay if they were parked on Centennial so that there was access from both sides of this development. But I wouldn't want to generally see parking on Centennial. I think protecting the needs of those industrial users to the east is really important, but tucking in 2 car share parking spots. I agree with Councillor Herford. I wouldn't mind seeing a few spots near the dike if people wanted to access that. I actually think our light industrial use should be very much protected for a light industrial use. So I'm not 100% sold on putting a beverage manufacturing there with tasting rooms. Food, yes. But again, I think my comments is more reflected around, could we put a restaurant use that has a beverage manufacturing attached, and would that work? And again, I know parking needs to be considered, but this is supposed to be a neighborhood hub. And you can walk there from North Yards, you can walk there from the Finch Drive and Robin Drive area, and Ravenswood. So, yeah. And so anyway, again, let's not over put parking here. This is, to me, it's not my highest concern. I want to create a really walkable, livable neighborhood if this goes forward. I think we need to look at the lowest cost option for water to the campground. I'm just really fearful of putting over $300,000 in a pipe to MRSA campground, and then in the next big flood event gets wiped out. And that's a lot of infrastructure costs at the same time, we need to help that campground be viable. So anyway, that might be just something we have to swallow, and we can consider how we spend that money later. I do want to consider the current tenants that are leasing from us on short-term leases. And I thought there would be more in this presentation around addressing the climate emergency, since that's a priority for this council. I know there's some brief notes sort of deep in the document about being solar ready and that sort of thing, but I think that this proponent, should it be successful in going forward, is going to find itself coming up towards, the step 4 requirement in January 1, 2021 for us. And so just, even if they were going to experiment with doing a net zero emissions home, just want to demonstrate that it can be done. That would be kind of cool for this neighborhood and for whoever got to purchase that home. But something to consider as this comes forward for second reading. Yeah, and I'm happy to have conversations with council at a much later date about how we spend these amenity funds. I don't think that has to be decided. There's certainly cash provided for us to do with what we need to do. So that, to me, isn't a discussion we need to figure out today. I think that's it.
Councillor Stoner.
Thank you, Chair. So first and foremost, I think I really appreciate the proposed phasing of the development that the proponent put forward. I think that it's encouraging to see the direction that is going. I was also very happy to hear or see that the dike is being built to 1 in 500-year flood event level. That was a good clarification. I think my comments, I'm happy to see this move forward to second reading. I want to reiterate the consideration around the diversity of affordable housing units. I think that is key for me. Seeing this, having them all within the apartment unit is just a little bit disheartening, to be frank. So I think that there's more that can be done, even if it is, just as Mayor Elliott mentioned, one triplex or just one alternative form something in that direction would be nice to see. I agree that a minimum of 2 car share vehicles is necessary for the car share to actually be successful in the long term. You know, that is something that we've heard loud and clear from the car share operators themselves. And I'm fine with going with the 5-to-1 parking in order to make that happen if that's what it's going to require it to do. But I also do, I think, reiterate that it is a selling feature for that future development as well, to have that sort of amenity in place. My one biggest hesitation, I think, seeing this move forward is without having the insight or the detail of the employment land study or strategy, as well as the zoning bylaw rewrite. I would like staff to really give this proposal consideration in light of those projects, and perhaps even run this by Kate or ECDev for comment. Mostly I'm curious about how do we develop this clear vision or direction on where these industries should go. So I'm curious about whether, as Mayor Elliott proposed, do we flip the model to allow for more commercial beverage manufacturing in this area, or not, and put it somewhere else. But I do think of Port Moody in particular and their kind of brewery row as an example here. And I think that unless we have that direct intention of making that happen somewhere, we're going to continue to kind of come up against this challenging component of trying to do too many things in one area. And so it would be helpful to see staff give that a little bit of consideration before this comes back to second reading. And that's it for me.
Thank you. So, being the last to speak, of course, a lot of the points that I would have covered have already been covered, but I do want to emphasize the affordable housing issues, partly the ones that I raised, in other words, who would own it. I think to me that just needs clarification. I don't really have a strong view one way or the other, and I know there's a commercial reality to these, and very often they are sold off to investors. But I think the management part is critical, and I think we want to be careful about that, and my preference would be to have it included in the district portfolio of properties under management to ensure that it actually does sort of fit with our affordable housing strategy going forward. I agree with the comments about the diversity. I think about a development, the regional district considered in Britannia, where there are a couple of townhouses that will be affordable units. I think that's just one of the housing styles that we have in our community, and we need some of those to be affordable. And I'm not going to be prescriptive about the number, but I think there's a balance between that and the apartment style. The light industrial discussion kind of intrigues me a little bit. This proposal is put forward as a neighborhood hub, and it's something we identified in the last council term as something that's desirable for neighborhoods, and to start proceeding in this way because, among other things, it makes a lot of the services walkable. If we are really going to do that, then I think, and I think it was Councillor Stoner that mentioned it, you know, things like a coffee shop or a restaurant or place that serves alcohol is perhaps desirable in there, because that's very often what people like to walk to in a neighborhood pub and sit and chat, and particularly when you're serving alcohol, it's preferable to be walking in near transit, and this site is both. So I would urge staff to consider that possibility, whether it's on one side or the other. I don't care. I think just the development overall might support that. And if I understand some of the problems that we see in the business park that were sort of referred to, some of them I think are the cost of retrofitting existing spaces to meet a higher fire standard. And so if that's the case, then this might be one of those instances where we start off requiring certain fire standards that give the flexibility going forward, rather than have to have somebody come in and try to retrofit it. And everybody I've spoken to that's in this business tells me it's a lot cheaper to build it when you're doing it at the start, rather than come back and try and do it later. So we might give some thought to that. The car share, I agree with the comments that there should be more than one. Frankly, I'm not sure that we need to trade it off. I don't know why it wouldn't be just one for one. I think parking generally is going to be strained in this area, and I wouldn't want to be giving up too many parking stalls. But I do think this development would probably benefit from having more than one car share spot. And I would be happy to see it just happen on a one-for-one basis. So with that, I don't have any other comments. Seeing nothing, I'll call for the question. All those in favor of the motion?
Do you want to summarize?
Oh, I beg your pardon. You're right. I'm sorry. Thank you, Ms. Arley.
That was good.
Go ahead,
Through
staff.
the chair, I think we're actually pretty clear, but thank you.
Do you have? Could you actually just summarize it for the benefit of council, so council understands?
There's a lot of pages.
There's a lot. Okay, I'll go for it. So, okay, that is a good idea to summarize. So the car share.
You don't have to make a decision on it, but just if you capture the comments. Go ahead, Mayor Elliott.
Perhaps I can make a suggestion is just to reiterate the ones where you feel there's consensus. And then the other ones, because I definitely heard some where there was more than 4 votes around the table that would drive that direction forward. So rather than repeat everything, maybe focus on the ones where you heard there was general consensus or at least the requirement for a conversation.
Ones that maybe there wasn't consensus, could we also raise those to get consensus?
Good, sure.
Okay, so,
Roundabout.
okay, roundabout, that's easy. So support for roundabout.
Housing diversity.
Support for affordable housing diversity. Support to increase the number of car share spaces. Let's see. Consensus to look to some of those short-term lease tenants, to potentially have them in spaces in this proposal.
If I might, if I read that correctly, I think it's to capture having space that might be suitable for tenants like that, rather than restrict it to those particular tenants.
No, I meant those tenants.
You meant those tenants, okay.
Yeah, there were a number of items that I think staff heard from one or maybe not more, the majority council. So, yeah, the number of car share stall ratio. So I think we heard from 2 councillors, or 3, the 5 to 1 was good. Others felt less. Are we going to reach a decision on that today? No. Okay. The one I wanted to clarify was the spawning channels was raised by 1 council member. Do other councillors feel? 2, sorry. Okay.
I think the point coming out of that is, and we don't have to make that decision today again, I think as the mayor stated, is that we retain discretion to deal with those funds.
Okay.
And that'll be a further discussion.
Point of research, really,
Okay.
for this time.
Also the camping item. So looking for this proposal to propose a sort of a solution to that community issue. Is that something that the majority of council would look to this proposal to provide?
I didn't get that consensus actually. I mean, it's an outstanding issue in the community generally, and whether or not this proposal would be able to affect that one way or the other.
If council felt it appropriate, we could also have these conversations at the broader planning meetings around camping and the camping continuum. That might be a good place to get some recommendations there.
It seemed like there was consensus around having more than 1 car share spot. There was a lot of interest in having multiple car share spots.
I think with respect to this, to the camping, it's going to be one of the decisions going forward, recognizing that this proposal talks about converting a campground to something else. And so we're not going to decide at this meeting. It's sort of fundamental to the proposal. Is this clarification? Because we're sort of at the...
Yeah, I think it's just clarification. I see the camping as being called out with the contribution and then our discussion around how those funds get addressed in the community's work. So I'm not saying the camping's not important, but I feel that that's that discussion around where those funds are.
So to answer staff's question, then I don't think it's specific to this vote. We're not looking for a solution to camping problems. We will deal with what's been offered or what comes out of this development to go along that route. Am I correctly stating it for council? Is that for this vote? It's not the end of the discussion. So.
One final item I'd just like to clarify is the employment land use. So staff is hearing a desire for increasing the amount of employment space for looking at the employment density. So whether there is, through the employment study, zoning bylaw rewrite, a demand for that upper story, maybe non-industrial use to add employment space in general. And then what I wanted to clarify from Councillor Stoner was, I think what I heard was that we're having, you know, the breweries are in the business park, but is for staff to look at whether this might be potentially either preserved as light industrial land, or on the flip side, maybe a hub for brewery use or that sort of thing.
Did you catch that, Councillor Stoner?
Yeah, I did, and I think that is on point where it's just, it would be helpful to have staff have a bit of a discussion or some thought around where does that particular use work, and is it going to kind of stay in the business park, or is there an opportunity to kind of transition this space or somewhere else to fit that need?
So would it be fair to say that the feeling from council is that the employment land is important, it's important there's employment here, there's a desire to have some services like restaurants or pubs or something that would meet a node, but there's an open question around whether or not that area should be preserved for true light industrial, or maybe if this could be an appropriate place to land it, it could be this type of zoning that allows more commercialized uses like the breweries. Maybe this is a good spot for it. So council's got an openness to which of those lands based on the needs from the employment land study. Is that correct, or am I off on that?
Yes, thank you for being more articulate than I am, as I'm jet lagged.
But I saw a question in eyes of...
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the light industrial use is important. It's whether you can fit the other one on this site.
Right, okay.
Without complicating the light industrial use. It's a higher density of employment, was certainly what I was trying to express.
Right.
And I would rather take out the beverage manufacturing from the light industrial and keep it more to true light industrial and not confuse it as we've done in the business park, and find another location on the site for a restaurant.
On the site.
On the north side, on the side, whatever. So it's a net.
So to clarify, actually you're looking to, you feel like achieving some pure light industrial on the site is important, and perhaps there could be an alternate location on the site that could meet that need. My original understanding was maybe
it's not either or.
Either or. You're like, can we do both in different locations on site? Is that clear? That's right?
Yeah.
Okay.
One other element for clarification was parking on Centennial. Staff is hearing, because the industrial truck user concerns and everything else, that we're not looking for parking on Centennial, other than maybe fitting in a few car share stalls, but that council would like staff to see whether there's space for some public parking in that dike gravel area.
Yeah, there were comments that way. I'm not sure that's sort of germane to the decision. It's one of those details that maybe it's going to be a future decision.
Yeah.
But there are thoughts that way. So,
Okay.
anything else, council? Anything we missed? Councilor Benton?
There's some comments about viewscapes that I didn't reiterate but resonated with me. And then also some comments around, in various ways, but shading, sort of preserving the natural aspect of this, some of the climate type things, like sort of lumping all that together. But I think there's maybe some room for improvement in those areas.
Yeah, there were comments around that, and I think staff had those. Anything else? Then I will call the question. All in favor of the motion with those comments? Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So I'm going to ask for a 5-minute recess. We have another item on the agenda. I'm not sure exactly where they are. And we have lunch. Thank you and welcome back. We are now on to staff reports, item 3, sub 3, Arts, Culture, and Heritage Strategy Update. Please guest.
Thank you, Mayor, Chair, and Council. Thanks for having us. My name is Devin Guest. For those in the audience, I am Acting Director of Recreation Services, and I'm joined by Sarah Dicker, Acting Manager of Arts and Culture. Our objective is to be, other than being brief today, is to update Council on the progress and where we are in the stages of the Arts, Culture, and Heritage Strategy. And what we can expect next. To review the responses to the broad community survey, and really to get a gut check from council around the table. As a stakeholder, your thoughts and opinions are crucial to this step. Switching gears, just for a bit of background for those in attendance and watching. In April-May, Council endorsed a process which the output of which will be the Arts, Culture, and Heritage Strategy. And the goals of that strategy are up on the screen, and in the for the sake of time, I'll jump forward. Further to those goals, what the strategy, we really drilled down in terms of what we wanted answered. What can the district do to support access to cultural experiences? What barriers do you face in accessing cultural experiences? How do you want to participate in arts and culture experiences? So my apologies, that should read arts, culture, and heritage experiences. So where are we? Discovery and research took place with a scan, collect, and research from April, probably bled a little bit more into the summer. The broad-based community engagement has concluded with a great uptake from the community of approximately 900 survey respondents, which we're going to hear more about in just a little bit. And we're starting to see themes bubble up. And within kind of those themes, we're also starting to see some, let's call them synergies or alliances through our colleagues working on the youth strategy, as well as through economic development and the sector strategy. So, so as the arrow indicates, we're starting to see themes. Once the specific and targeted stakeholder engagement will conclude by mid-November, you'll see us back here at the beginning of December with the first draft, and then back again for adoption, conclusion, final discussions in January as well. A few questions to consider just as you're looking at the feedback for the first time. These are the initial few questions that my colleague and the facilitators of the stakeholder workshops kind of set the tone for some thoughtful discussion around the table. So I'm sure you have your own lenses at which you would like to kind of disseminate and evaluate this information. I encourage you to be interactive. There's, wouldn't be an arts and culture presentation if there weren't markers and sticky notes. So I'll turn this over to Sarah as one of the facilitators, and she's going to take you through the intentions behind the questions, as well as the results. Take it away. Thank you. Good afternoon, Council. Just before we get into the results of the questions, I just wanted to point out to Council that questions are broken out into 3 distinct groups. The first group or category will focus on the current state of arts, culture, and heritage within Squamish. The second group will look at the aspirations and the desires of the community as we move forward. And the third group will focus on the existing barriers within the community that prevent our members from accessing these experiences. So as we review the first question, it's asking how many times per year do you participate in arts, culture, and heritage activities in Squamish? And in this question, we really wanted to find out how many times our community members are interacting or perceiving that they're interacting in arts, culture, and heritage within the community. And we did not define arts, culture, and heritage at the beginning of this survey to leave it up to the participants to really give their perspective on how they interact or perceive they're interacting in arts, culture, and heritage. So we see the results in front of us state 32% perceiving that they engage in arts, culture, and heritage 1 to 3, 34% 3 to 7, 17% 10 to 15 times, and 18% at 15 or more. For the sake of time, shall I recommend that we go through all of them and then we can go back and forth?
So moving on to the next question, there's kind of 2 components here. We ask, do you feel that there are enough arts, culture, and heritage experiences in Squamish? And then we kind of delve into the results of that a little bit deeper. So what we really wanted to find out here was how the current state of arts, culture, and heritage experiences and what's available to the public for them to interact with. So 60% saying no, that there are not enough experiences, 30% saying yes, and 10% saying other. When we delve deeper in there, we see that 47% want more experiences. 27% are saying there are lots of experiences when they look for them. 18% with not enough experiences, and then we kind of have the 2 polar opposites or the 2 extremes in the survey, with 2% saying that they feel like our community is already very culturally vibrant, and 4% think that it's non-existent within Squamish. 3% feel like we don't need more experiences. Yep. So this slide has a lot to take in. The question here is what types of experiences would you participate in? So the questions are kind of paraphrased on the slide, and the intent behind this is to find out what events people in Squamish are currently participating in. So this was to select all that apply. So people could really choose all or 1 or 2 if they preferred. And what we really wanted to gauge from this is what people are consistently experiencing and what they're more likely to participate in that's already existing with our community and that we can focus on moving forward. So we have 73% live music, theater, festivals coming in close with 63%, and going down, council can review this, it's on the table in front of you as well, and we can come back to it later if you have any further questions on that. In the same kind of mindset, we wanted to find out where people go currently in the community to experience arts, culture, and heritage. And we didn't specifically identify any spaces within Squamish that exist because we didn't want to create bias over one particular space. We also didn't want to miss something out and be questioned on why it wasn't included. So they're very broad categories, and people have responded 87% event or festival, public spaces, art galleries, and then we see it kind of coming down into cafes, local businesses, and schools on the other end of the spectrum. And now we're kind of shifting our mindset into the aspirations and the desires of the community. So what we wanted to find out from this question was where we can improve in providing opportunities for arts, culture, and heritage in the community. And the results show more dedicated spaces, more funding sources, and more performing arts as the top 3
three areas that we can help, with some close contenders being more events, more information, and more public art coming in there. In this question, we wanted to really focus on areas of action for the strategy. And so we asked people to identify from a list of 23 options what they wanted us to focus on in terms of what the community wants to see developed moving forward. So live music, festivals, theaters, Indigenous heritage, and public art were the top 5 categories out of 23 that the community wants to focus on moving forward. Then now we're moving into the final phase of the survey, which was identifying barriers that exist within the community which are preventing people from participating in arts, culture, and heritage. So not enough concentrated facilities coming in at the top result there, followed by lack of funding for producers, unaware of opportunities. The next two could kind of be grouped together, we feel. Not enough going on and not enough available information. So perhaps there is enough going on, but there's a barrier there with the information not coming through. Costs are too high, limited opening hours, and then about 10% saying they don't have trouble at all, with 9% hard to access. Could be physically or could be economically. There's a number of factors why people may have difficulty accessing. And then we wanted to really leave this area of the survey open for people to write in case we missed a barrier in the categories that we provided. And this is a word cloud generated from the most commonly used words in that open response section. So that's there for council and stakeholders to review and draw themes from.
Sarah.
Thank
so
you.
What I want to stress right now is that we're in the second, more specific phase of stakeholder engagement, where our facilitators are out meeting one-on-one with those specific stakeholder groups and really spending time with the outcomes and feedback in the survey, unpacking the results, forming discussion around the results. Ground truthing the initial broad community responses. Our facilitators are at, I think, hovering around 13 or 14 one-on-ones having been completed, with the rest which will be complete by the end of November. After the one-on-ones, there will be, as I mentioned, 2 or 3 very specific workshops to invite those stakeholders back to further unpack the themes and trends that we're starting to see bubble up in this engagement. So I get the sense that this might not be as interactive as we maybe had anticipated at first, and given the timing, but I do welcome council to jump in, provide us with a bit of a temperature check, and provide us with any feedback or inspiration moving forward.
Councilor French.
Thank you. This is great. Great info. Clearly some great work is being done. And I'm a little surprised you didn't mention this. The level of participation to generate this was extremely high, correct?
It's very exciting to have seen the uptake around the community in this survey. We attended a broad range of community events over the summertime, and people were engaged, willing, and eager to take the survey and excited about what was to come.
So my one bit of feedback at this point is recognizing that this is great work so far. I feel like heritage is a little bit of the forgotten child in all of this. It's telling that in one of the first slides, the word heritage didn't even show up there. So going forward, I would encourage staff to have that in the back of your brain of maybe think of it as heritage, culture, and art, and get heritage right up front there so that it doesn't continue to be the forgotten child.
Thank you. If I may, the heritage groups that were outlined in the real estate and facilities master plan, they have all been engaged and identified as a stakeholder as a part of the strategy.
Councilor Pender.
So I have a bit of a personal bias towards music and live music and so on.
Shall I go back to?
No, it's okay. Just reflecting on, some of the bigger festivals and everything from the big festivals to Antelope Park. We've arguably had some prompting or exposure, which makes me wonder, are some of the preferences we're seeing things that sort of people have had a taste of and so they're gravitating towards that versus if there's a bit more of a prodding or opportunity, we might see that shift and maybe it's sort of besides the point, we've got some momentum in some areas, we'll just keep pursuing that. But in some regard, maybe it relates to Councillor French's point about, people maybe not know they're missing something yet, and so they can't express it. And it's just a question, and which again we may not be able to tackle anyways, but it just sort of makes me wonder what's driving these numbers.
Do you want to respond or?
Sure. Sorry, I saw. Excellent feedback. We don't know until we start, and this is our start.
Councillor Herford or Councillor Anderson?
Thank you. I think this might go a little bit off what Councillor Pennington was sort of similar theme. You mentioned a bunch of events this summer to sort of drum up the responses to this, and I see events or festivals rank really high.
Absolutely.
And I'm curious about asking people at events and festivals if that's something that ranks high for them, and how that sort of plays into the methodology here as far as weighting that versus, being at spending time asking people at a museum if the museum is an important place for them to be, or anything else on the list, and just so we give it appropriate weighting and consideration. Could you speak to that?
Absolutely. It's definitely a bias that is taken into account. We also have statistical. This is a community engagement exercise, and not research. So using that lens, we absolutely have to acknowledge and be careful of our interpretation of the results and weigh that appropriately.
Sorry, I'm getting a little distracted by Councillor French's arch project here, so just. Mayor Elliott.
That's why he's the chair of the Public Art Committee. Public art. Do we have the demographics behind these numbers? So by neighborhood and by age, I'd be really curious to see who responded and from where.
Absolutely, we'd be happy to, when we send council out the presentation with the rest of the minutes, we'll send the full PowerPoint as well as the full demographic breakdown.
And then these focus groups with specific stakeholder groups, I imagine we're exploring the bias that my colleagues have brought up and potentially disagree. Sometimes we don't know what we don't know because we don't know what's maybe missing.
Absolutely.
So it's a valid point. So hopefully these groups can really help us get to the bottom of what some of these themes might mean for us going forward. Thank you for the work.
So Anderson, Councillor Pettengill.
Yes, there is, and probably as was identified in the real estate and facilities master plan or a strategy document, 7 members of a loose coalition of heritage interests, including the Squamish Public Library. And you'll be aware of that list. Now, during this is going back some time that we look forward to this strategy, there was a notion within that community that meetings should be held to gather or shape a collective input, which has not taken place. However, there is a workshop upcoming on November 2nd, and it's my impression that each of those 7 groups, which also includes Squamish Nation, are looking forward to that workshop as the opportunity to undertake that dialogue that hadn't taken place so far with the meeting. We used to meet at the library. I'm a member of one of those groups, and we have had several meetings at the library involving all of them. So I would encourage looking at that November 2nd workshop being sponsored by the Squamish Historical Society, but with broad participation, as an opportunity to really valuable opportunity to gather input and to encourage that dialogue between those groups to share their experiences and suggestions. So I'll just let you respond to that suggestion of the importance of this November 2nd workshop.
We've reached out to the Squamish Historical Society and pitched the exact same idea. We're waiting to hear back from them.
Thank you. I noticed that the City of Kelowna has just released a cultural plan, 2020 to 25 cultural plan. Now Kelowna, as we can appreciate, is 4 times the size of Squamish at least.
Yes.
But there's plenty here in terms of interesting information and a process that they've gone through that may be of interest to us. My question then is, to what extent have you looked to other communities at cultural strategy processes to borrow and benchmark with?
Thank you for your question. In short, we looked at approximately, during the discovery and research phase, we looked at approximately 20 to 25 different communities across BC mostly, but we definitely bled into the western provinces. Each community, so yes, we did a landscape scan using, specifically pulling out all communities that had robust and current arts and culture and heritage strategies.
Thank you. Leave it that now.
Councillor Pettengill, and then we're going to go to Councillor French to explain this project that's going on here.
Do we have any plans to engage, and I'm not suggesting we should or shouldn't, but about who has responsibility for the things that people have identified we want? Like, if live music is something we really value as a community, is there a sense that they would prefer us to have no role as a municipality and just deal with it at a permitted uses level, or we should actually be putting taxpayer dollars forward, or are we getting any of that sort of feedback?
I believe that the themes that are bubbling up as a part of the survey, as a part of the strategy right now, we need to apply the questions and the goals of the strategy in order to meet the community's desires as well as realities of the environment. And so that has not been, we haven't got there yet, but I suspect that we will need to acknowledge a gap.
Can I please add to that? I think this is a very good question, and what the role of the municipality is, especially in the realm of arts and culture, is really nebulous and really challenging, and lots of people have opinions about it. The objective of the recommendations of the strategy will look at where is it the municipality's role to, and where are we going to see the biggest return on investment for a focus of our resources on a particular thing. So in some areas or some sectors, like for example live music, that might be one thing. We might have sort of one lever there that we can use to help promote those activities in the community. In another area like arts programming, for example, we obviously have significantly more influence and bigger levers to generate a return on investment that's aligned with the community's interests as they've indicated. So it's going to look different depending on what the thing is, but that's what we'll be looking at.
Councillor French.
I just wanted to make sure heritage didn't get lost, so it's more emphasis on heritage.
Certainly is. Councillor Anderson.
The upcoming November 2nd workshop is being facilitated by Heritage BC, which is a non-profit that provides advice to the provincial government, among other things. Last year, Donna Wall, who's with us in the audience, representing Tourism Squamish and the Forestry Centre Society, and myself attended a Heritage BC workshop in North Vancouver, and it was largely attended by municipal staff from Whistler all the way to Deep Cove on the North Shore and Sea to Sky. And one of the things that was an eye-opener for me was the value of coming to terms with definitions. So my question is, do you anticipate giving some attention to this, or have you already? Because this is, it seems to me, in the first brick to put in place is understanding what we mean by heritage, what we mean by culture. Is arts a part of culture, just like heritage is? I'm just tossing this around, but I felt out of that workshop that Don Wall and I attended that was a revelation and cleared the pathway for clear discussion and identification of issues and opportunities. I just wondered to what extent you've identified that you may kind of have a focus that hasn't been attended to yet on definitions.
Our UNESCO, when staff originally presented the process outline to council, we touched briefly on the definition that we were using in terms of the UNESCO definition of arts and culture, which I believe, and I might be within the UNESCO definition, I believe heritage falls under culture, but I would need to secure that to know specifically. I think.
Yeah, I think this is a good question through the chair. Thanks for that. I think especially a focus on definitions might be valuable if we are creating something of a kind of responsibility matrix or an agreement about whose scope is where, that we might want to clarify that and have some group discussion around that and see what the other members of the community think about that. Yeah, thank you for that. We have not attended to that much.
Could you just go back to the original, the where we are slide?
Mm-hmm.
And so the next steps, strategy development and review and completion. Strategy development, is that going back out to the public, or is that just sort of an internal digestion of what you've received?
After the one-on-ones finish and after we finalize the workshops, that's when it will come in-house to create a draft. And then whether or not we socialize that draft with the stakeholders or the community beyond that, we're waiting to see. The plan was to socialize it within the stakeholders who have been engaged, and then bring it to council in draft in December, with feedback and final tweaks by January.
I notice looking at the Kelowna cultural plan that's just been released, there's extensive reference to the City of Kelowna real estate and facility strategy, or the comparable document to the one we've just dealt with recently. Has that been the case in your efforts so far, that you are referring to this document, and may perhaps even as we develop the final strategy have some recommendations for it? Could you comment on the real estate and facility strategy and perhaps other strategies as you made your journey so far?
In short, yes. We're seeing many of the same themes in the real estate and facilities master plan come up. And it is part of, as we deal with the sector strategy and the outputs of the youth engagement strategy, the real estate and facilities master plan is definitely part of the content and knowledge that this community holds that will contribute to the outcomes of the strategy or the first draft.
Go ahead.
You have referred to sector strategy, and that triggers me another aspect of the Kelowna plan that there is extensive reference to tourism sector strategy. Has Tourism Squamish been identified and engaged with as a partner in this plan?
Yes.
Councillor Patton.
Is there any chance the final report will come to us as a performance piece?
I'm gonna work with that feedback.
Yeah,
Call it a maybe.
So the markers aren't enough, eh?
Can you make that into a motion, Councillor Pettengill?
We're about to wrap up. Councillor Stoner, are you good?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks for the update, staff.
Okay. That's it. So you're not looking for a resolution, this is just an update?
Correct.
So we'll have a resolution to receive. Moved by the mayor, second by Councillor Herford. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll just take a 5-minute recess to allow you to clean up Councillor Finch's project. And thank you and welcome back. We're now on item 3 sub 4, and we have a delegation from the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, Christie Harvie. Welcome. And this is an attempt. This is an agenda item because it's an attempt, I think, to try to just sort of provide a little information surrounding land transfers and negotiations with First Nations. It is a process of accommodation. It is a process, I think, of reconciliation. And I think it is for our information and for the information of the community as a whole. It is something that as a local government we seem to have very little to do with it, but we are certainly very interested in it and we are obviously affected by it. But welcome, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. So I brought a short PowerPoint, so I'm not sure if everybody can see that, but so this is just, I've just called it reconciliation and land transfers because I just wanted to touch briefly on what you were talking about as part of your opening comments, which is that land transfers and the accommodation agreements we do are part of reconciliation with First Nations and a lot of or Indigenous peoples more broadly as well. And I think a lot of people kind of wonder what we mean when we say reconciliation. What does that mean? What does it mean to individuals? What does it mean to governments in a larger way? So this slide just talks about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission outlining what reconciliation is and the definition of forging and maintaining respectful relationships between, now we would say Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in the country. Awareness of the past, acknowledgement of the harm that's been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and action to change behavior. So it is different for each community and it requires understanding at the community level. So it's one of those things where when I go in to talk to a community about something, whether it's a treaty, an economic development opportunity, something else they've approached us with or we've approached them with, we go in very much with the ears open, mouth closed a little bit more than we used to, I would say. So who was it? I think it was Don Wright. He likes to say, you have 2 ears in one mouth and use them appropriately. So each community has different concerns. Each community has a different reality. So that's kind of one of the main pieces too, because people sort of think of it as this broad policy that we take with us when we get to the table. So there's been changing expectations. This government has brought in high expectations for substantive and transformative change. They've made a number of commitments. So we used to kind of come from our agreements from the place of the statutory duty to consult versus a place of reconciliation and, kind of bringing in the blanket, here's what we have, versus coming in and acknowledging that there are Indigenous rights. The shift in sort of the way the government has chosen to say, we're going to seek to implement the United Nations Declaration, and how does that actually roll out when you talk to people or approach negotiations? So this slide just talks about the many paths to reconciliation. So there's a number of ways that we are putting this to work every day. How do we approach conversations? How do we approach agreements? I think my approach has always been very kind of collaborative, and how can we work together to get to where the nations need to be and we need to be. So some of those ways are treaties. The Squamish Nation is not in the treaty process at this time, but we do have other agreements. There's reconciliation agreements that are out there. Treaties tend to be a tripartite process with the federal government involved. Reconciliation agreements are, at this point, bilateral or tripartite, depending on the engagement of the different parties, the location, the needs of the community, and the needs of the government. So it's not a super defined term at this point. And then there's other pieces that are collaborative approaches. There are social and cultural innovations and agreements, just items where we're trying to work better with communities to move forward to meet their needs. It might not be that they want a reconciliation agreement, it might not be that they want a treaty, but it might be that this is a specific issue, right? Like there's a lot of work done also around, obviously, the 2010 Olympics. Here's the specific things that we're trying to look to move forward. How do we better improve the sea to sky corridor? What do we do as part of that? So those are some of the different ways that we get to having land transfers. There's a number of other items. There's specific claims to the federal government. There's requirements sometimes nations need, like cemeteries fill up, and how do they get more land? And so there's specific items. The broader agreements, things like the reconciliation agreements and treaties, some of the components are things, governance, things that are common, governance, environmental concerns, decision-making authority, so who lets all the tenures on the lands, accommodation, as you talked about, land transfers, engagement, how do we engage with the nations? There's agreements out there like the Seashell Foundation agreement and relationship forums. So that's something that's also kind of come out under the Seashells agreement. So there's a whole variety of tools that we now use compared to what used to be a fairly small boxed-in piece. Do you guys want me to sort of stop for questions as you go, or just keep going?
Are there any questions? Usually they're not shy about sticking their hand
Okay,
up.
perfect. So we get down to land selection. So a land selection might be part of, I'll start off with a treaty just because it tends to be kind of the broadest area. But we do them very similarly regardless of the specific agreement. If it's over a piece of land, like for instance, like the Ministry of Transportation will need to widen a highway or something, and they'll have very specific ways of doing it. With respect to the Ministry of Indigenous Relations, most often we're doing them through either treaty arrangements or economic development agreements. So in this case, we'd start off by looking at, so if it's an agreement with the Squamish Nation, what is the territory of the Squamish Nation? Because in general, one of the principles we start off with is it needs to be within the territory of the nation that we're dealing with. That's not actually always the case. There are some nations, for instance, on the island where they only have essentially, and I'll say essentially, but vacant crown land. So there's no hydro there, there's nothing there. They've been moved off of their traditional territory. Maybe everybody lives in a city now. So they don't necessarily want a piece of land in the middle of nowhere versus someplace that their kids can go to school and there's hospitals and things like that. So there have been other approaches. But in general, it's what does the territory look like? And we start there. And then what are the current crown lands in that territory? If it's a tripartite agreement, so if the federal government's involved, that also includes federal lands. So one of the areas I work on is Lower Vancouver Island. Victoria has very little to no crown land that doesn't have, for instance, a building on it. But there's a lot of D&D lands. So in some cases, if you were following some of the conversations that have taken place on the island, D&D is talking about agreements that they're making with nations around access to federal lands. Sorry, D&D, Department of National Defense. So Victoria is very much a military town still. So yeah, so the federal government has significant land holdings there, whereas the provincial government does not. So we'd start by looking at what are all of the crown land holdings in an area. And that doesn't mean it necessarily precludes anything from a hospital or a base or any of those things, because we're starting off with here's the territory. Okay, now what's the crown land? because at this point, we don't touch private land unless it's a willing seller, willing buyer. Somebody comes to us and says, hey, we'd love to do this. Recent one was Genoa Bay in the Cowichan Valley, where the nation has, I say reacquired it because it used to be reserve land, and then it wasn't, and now they've purchased it back. So we look at the Crown land, and then we look at what isn't needed for essential services. And I'm saying we do this now, but I think that is also shifting to an extent. You know, some of the proposals we've had from nations are, you know, it doesn't matter to us that this building is there. We're perfectly happy to be your landlord. So if there's arrangements that can be made, those are the types of things that we're now having conversations about, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily matter like who has the title for the land if you still have an agreement around it. So yeah. So, but in general, we look for Crown land that is available to transfer. And by available, I usually mean not tied up with extensive interests or very fixed interests that might not work for land accommodations with the nations. Well, it narrows it down essentially from here's the territory to it tends to be here's these little pieces. If you go further north, it's bigger swaths of land just because of the nature of, you know, the urban nature of the Lower Mainland or the island. So I'm going to sort of stick to kind of more the urban areas because I think that's probably a little bit more applicable to you guys. So then we look at that and we look at what our mandate is. So what have we been given as far as this agreement has this type of impact on this many people. So we'll be given essentially a mandate or seek a mandate from Treasury Board and Cabinet and they'll come back with this is what you can do. So then from that we take, here's the available Crown land, here's the mandate, and essentially we start to try to match it up and see what the interest, we take this to the nation and we say here's where we're at, and they might ask us questions like, well, what about this parcel? I know that's included, or what about this parcel? And I'd like to still consider this. And so we'll go back and forth. I'll get reports on what the interests on the land are. So once we start to narrow it down, because it's a lot of work for the line agencies, Ministry of Forests, Ministry of Mines, Environment, all of the line agencies, I will send out something to them saying, hey, here are the pieces of land that we're looking at. Can you please send me any information you have on interests on the land? So that'll be things like, you know, forestry tenures, mining tenures, rec sites and trails. Sometimes it's, you know, heli-skiing or waterworks. Also, any of the, you know, flood information or things like that that may be relevant to the nation when they're deciding if that would make sense as a piece of land that they would want to take on responsibility for, because they might just be taking on a liability that they have to pay tax on that doesn't actually help them meet their community's goals. So we'll do some of the back and forth. I'll get some of the information on the interests, we'll talk to the nations, and we'll start to kind of get down to here are the 3 or 4 or 5, whichever parcels that make sense. While we're doing that, we're also looking at what are the overlapping nations. If there's overlapping nations or if there's shared territory, different nations refer to it in a different way. We tend to, we are required to make sure that overlapping nations are consulted with. If the lands are within municipal, regional district boundaries, we would come and talk to the appropriate local government, get some more feedback. And that also helps us narrow things down. We also compare that to what is the parcel viability. And by viability, I mean, you know, what is the nation looking for? Like, are they looking for lands to practice some of the cultural traditions? Are they looking for a downtown plot so that they can do some housing or they can have a commercial opportunity? We had a little tiny square in downtown Victoria. It was a former liquor store and a Squamish, and that was transferred to the Songhees Nation, and they turned it into a Red Barn Market. So now they worked with the community to figure out what would be appropriate for that area, and now they have, you know, opportunities for members to work and train and yeah, so it really kind of depends. So it's this big, start with the territory, what are the pieces, what have really heavy interests on it. We had, when we were looking at like the Squamish LNG agreement, there were some parcels where, part of the land was already held by the nation, and if we did the other portion, then there might be possible access issues, or there was, overlapping interests that didn't seem to make sense. So those parcels came off, and other ones went on. I know when I've come here before, we've talked about, some potential transfers in the future impacting things like community forest applications. And so when we go through those things, we have to essentially list all of the interests. As we get down to it, we list all of the interests on a parcel that we were able to find. So if we get narrowed down to, say, 10 parcels, here are all of the interests. With some of the restrictions, does the nation still want those parcels on the table? Because sometimes they're coming with, like I said, development restrictions, because the land transfers are going to be fee simple land transfers most of the time. They may get turned into treaty settlement land. The nation may apply for them to become additions to reserve. Those are all other processes. So as you go through that, it kind of gets narrowed down, and then you start to see, okay, here's the list of people that you need to talk to as we move to the next phase of, do these seem viable? So a lot of it tends to be, in BC, tends to be talking to forestry companies or the Ministry of Forests, I should say, as well as Ministry of Environment, wildlife protection areas, and local governments, right? Most of these areas are in there. And then the next step is also talking to, so let me just flip here. So we're engaging with the nations, we're engaging with the line agencies, because sometimes BC Hydro will say, well, we've got a major right-of-way through there and that's not compatible, or they may feel it's not compatible. And then the shared territory issues, local government concerns, stakeholder and user groups. So as we get down there, and a lot of times the information we get, the more we go through the engagement with each of these different groups, the more we find out about who else we have to engage with. So, for instance, we have, it's kind of, I think at one of the last meetings, someone brought up a group that I hadn't been aware of, didn't show up on any of my reports, because it's a local group that, goes out on the land and likes that area. So now I add them to, here's who I'm going to go and talk to, and then try to find contacts and see if there's a way for, part of it is determining if the interests are compatible or incompatible with whatever's going on, right? So having, looking at some of the parcels that are included in agreements, a lot of the times there might be forestry operations, and it may or may not matter who holds the underlying title, right? Those forestry operations may be able to continue. It might have to be under a different type of tenure. It might have to be under agreement with the nation. But until you actually find out from the nation what they want, find out from the operators what they need, you can't really figure out if it's incompatible. And if it is incompatible, then you come to that conclusion of, okay, so is this parcel going to stay in or out? And what does that mean? Does that mean there's compensation to potentially a tenure holder? Does that mean the transfer waits until the tenure holder has completed the activities that they were going to do on that? Do we put in a replacement tenure? So things like recreational trails, if it's not incompatible with the use and if the parties are all willing to talk together, then it's a matter of, okay, so what does this look like? And if there's continued use and it's private land now, what's the liability, right? Because if you're transferring land to me, I want to know what am I taking on by continuing to allow the access that you would like me to continue. So you kind of get down to how do we engage on each piece. And as you get from your broader territory down to the individual parcels, it becomes very much one-on-one conversations, trying to see if interests are compatible or incompatible, and then putting that decision up to the decision makers to say, hey, if we make this choice, here's what's going to happen, right? If we may have to, we may have to see if we can find additional replacement lands for a community forest, or it might be such a small impact that overall it's like 0.1%, so we're going to say that's not really likely. And then coming back and having those conversations, and a lot of it is trying to facilitate conversations between nations and between stakeholder or user groups, and then kind of getting out of the way. So part of my job is to say, okay, everybody's talking, you're going to be the new landholder, you guys still have an interest in the land, you guys are all going to be here, I'm only here for a temporary time while this agreement comes together. So trying to get people to really have that communication, that for me is part of the relationship building aspect of what we try to do. So then those relationships can continue on after, hopefully long after the agreement, and also after the land transfer has taken place. So on here also we have the public. This is kind of part of it. You know, some will go around, and if there's specific topics or community groups that want us to come and talk, we have no problem answering questions, trying to explain and help people to understand why we're doing what we're doing, because a lot of the time people can be very concerned. They feel, you know, in treaty there is language around access and continuing tenures and things like that, and people are a little bit more comfortable. In agreements, sometimes it's a little less clear, because it'll say, you know, continuing or access will be determined, or interest will continue to be dealt with. And unless people have that engagement, they don't necessarily know what we're looking for or what's meant. And sometimes it's very different by nation. So then once we get through all of those pieces, we continue kind of the due diligence on the feedback we've gotten. You know, continue talking, go and work with BC Hydro, for instance, to negotiate easements for continued access, or easements for waterworks, or hiking trail users, or all sorts of different pieces. So there's a lot of work that actually takes place before a land transfer. Even once you've hit an agreement, here's the lands. I'm going to use the Squamish agreement as an example again. Like in the Squamish LNG agreement, it talks about, you know, here are the lands, here are the triggers for those lands. But in the agreement, it also talks about, you know, we'll have to continue to work on the interests that are on the land. So there's a long time for those conversations to take place, and it's because we want to leave, you know, a positive relationship behind for the people that are going to be on the lands, and answer questions, because the reports that we get aren't always accurate. You know, they don't always have all the information, and until we hear from people, we're going to miss things. We try not to, but then the best that we can do is engage with those groups, find out what the interests are, and see if there's a way for them to be compatible. Yeah, and so it's an ongoing conversation, and I think I'm trying to think of, I don't know how long I would say an average is, but you know, most of the ones I've been on were sort of 8 years or longer, from sort of when we start identifying things to when lands are actually fully transferred and titled under someone else. So it can also be well over that, and I've seen some that have been very short time frames, but that was usually things where it was already under an agreement. So there's lots of agreements out there, which is a little bit of a challenge, right? In this area, there was the BC Rail Umbrella Agreement, there was the Sea to Sky Agreement, there's the Garibaldi at Squamish Agreement, there's the WLNG Agreement, and so all 4 of those agreements, land transfers are all tied to different things, and we try to minimize the impact on activities, but also, you know, maximize and meet the needs of the nation, particularly when the lands are very urbanized. So yeah, so that's sort of an overall rundown of in a bit of a general nature of a land transfer. So
Questions from this council? Council Bennett.
So you talked about bipartite, which is, I guess, province and First Nation, tripartite, province, feds, and First Nations. Municipalities is a group you engage with, but where is a municipal government in terms of, these words, I guess, acknowledge, I need to be careful here, but in terms of priority or importance of the municipality as a stakeholder relative to, say, a private business or a local user group or a crown corp like BC Hydro, like, is there a sort of ranking of precedence of those stakeholders, or they're all sort of equal, or?
It's a bit of a tricky question. You know, so there is actually a provincial UBCM MOU with respect to treaties and engagement, and it was renewed in 2018. So for instance, at a treaty table, and I'm going to use this as an example and then get down, just to give you a bit more context, but at a treaty table, the local government sits as a member of BC. So BC, the provincial team, includes members who are either council members or have been requested or hired by the council in order to sit in all those treaty meetings to make sure that people know what's going on. So the relationship with local government is a very important one, and so we do our best to have, you know, early engagement if it looks like lands will be in the municipal boundaries or within the regional district. So I think user groups tend to be more specific to a certain area. So it would be like the local government would be engaged earlier just by virtue of a combination of the relationship and the MOU, but also, you know, you guys have a broader area that you're looking at usually than someone like BC Hydro or a user group or things like that. So we do our best to try to engage as early as possible. I don't know if that helps answer the question, but because you guys have a broader area of sort of responsibility, I think. And you're part of the team.
Councilor Anderson.
On the wall here in council chambers, there was until recently a copy of a intergovernmental accord between the District of Squamish and the Squamish Nation. It was dated 2011, and it has a different status today, which is the reason why I understand it's not on the wall any longer. But my question is, does the provincial government have a program of offering advice or a guidebook or some kind of assistance to local government in putting together such local accords?
So I think, my understanding would be no, because there's not like a guidebook, or I think you're maybe thinking of like how to engage or something within nations. And part of the reason I'm saying no is because that kind of gets to sort of, you know, where I was talking about earlier about it being sort of a pan-Indigenous assumption versus working with individual local governments and working with individual nations. But I would have to look into if there are resources. I'm assuming there are actually resources, but it would probably be more with, not with my ministry, but more with your local government ministry. So municipal, or not municipal.
Thank you, that's probably the
Yeah.
case soon.
But I don't know that there's like a guidebook per se, yeah.
Why I asked that question is that in my previous capacity as a spokesperson for private industry, that accord was of extraordinary importance because it gave security and allowed for business planning. And not only that, but for other types of planning within the community. The role, to come back as a follow-up question really, the role of local government in identifying affected stakeholders and user groups. You have broadly touched on that, but I guess I'll just say that it seems to be of great importance, and no doubt this is something that many communities around the province will reflect on and pass on to you. But I suppose you have in your, well, maybe I should just ask you to speak to that. What have you already addressed policy on how the province sees the role of local government? It seems to me to be extraordinarily important. We have issues of local coordinated plans and so on. We can appreciate why that role is important.
I'm not super sure exactly what your question is.
So policy on how do you view and how do you have a protocol for engaging the local government beyond what you outlined fairly general terms here in consultation regarding these agreements?
So I would actually sort of direct a little bit more to the UBCM MOU agreement that was done in 2018. I know I sort of focused on it mainly as a treaty thing because it does include participation in treaty and implementation, but it does also talk about, you know, consultation and information exchange on other agreements and other initiatives, and how we engage on, you know, mutual matters that like interest, things that impact like local government jurisdiction. A lot of the things that I pick out when it comes to things like impacting jurisdiction tends to be more around on the treaty, does tend to be more on the treaty front when it comes to jurisdiction. But if you're kind of wondering, and I'm not familiar with the 2011 accord that you're referring to specifically, but I do understand, local government looking for, because the provincial government we used to call it certainty, and now we call it predictability, to help make sure that there are opportunities for government or business and operators to know kind of what they need to do. I think sort of going back maybe a bit to, if I say this wrong, correct me, but Councillor Pettingill, is it Pettingill? I don't want to say Pettingill, so. A question around, when do we engage with local government? I would say to be a little more clear, it is, once we find out from the line agencies, here's where the lands are, and some of these lands are they're identified within there, that's when we engage. So it is before all of the other user groups, because as you indicate, right, it is important that on a whole bunch of levels, in addition to the commitments made in the 2018 MOU, but it's important for us to hear back from you guys on how this impacts everything from a lot of nations or a lot of groups will say tax bases or economic opportunities or relationships with the nation, but also what are the other user groups. You guys are on the ground. Very often we're located in a different area, so.
Yeah, going to Mayor Elliott and then Councillor Herbert, but that 2011 agreement, I was involved in that, and that had a particular parcel of land that was zoned industrial, and the agreement provided that the nation, it was owned by the nation, and provided that the nation would not add it to reserve, so it would stay within municipal zoning regulation. So that was the extent of it. And we didn't directly consult the province with respect to that. They were aware of it, but they were not party to the agreement in that particular case. But I'll go to Mayor Elliott.
And thank you for coming today. This is really helpful to me. I know through the wood fiber agreement with the nation, there is that piece of being consulted early on when the different lands are sort of selected in that early stage. But then it sort of really kind of goes into the time when you're negotiating with the nation, and local government really has no role in that. And then it sort of pops out at the end, and we sort of get to find out what happened. I think there's more of an involvement when there's a treaty, but not on the land transfer. We actually have quite a small role to play, except for that initial comment on who might be on the land and how it may impact local government. But my question, for the benefit maybe of our community and this council, is in your slides, as you've gone through sort of each step in the process, where are we at? So you talk about this being a longer conversation, and maybe to be helpful to our community and some of the user groups, is where are we at in the conversation around accommodating different uses on the lands that are transferring? Is the province ready to step back, or is it still very much in that relationship building stage?
Sure. And with that, I would also note that there are like I mentioned, the agreements, the Sea to Sky agreement and the umbrella agreement and all those pieces. So I'll just focus on answering that question with respect to the wood fiber agreement, because each of them is going to be in a bit of a different stage.
We'll just focus on one.
Yeah. So with respect to that, it's essentially at this place here, which is the subsequent steps point, right? So due diligence on the feedback, ongoing engagement with line agencies, stakeholder and user groups, and negotiation with the nations. So in the wood fiber agreement, there are 3 sets of land transfers. So none of them have taken place as of now, right? The agreement's public. You can see that the first set is triggered by a combination of meeting a target or a milestone, which in that case, the first land transfer was signing of the agreement, but also the nation requesting the transfer. So, so the first 2 pieces are what we call the reserve regularization parcels, which is a bit of a mouthful, but those are also part of the BC Rail umbrella agreement. So we kind of sought to tie that together. North Reserve regularization has gravel pits on it, and we have BC Hydro lines and transmission lines on the south. We have roads that run in between reserves. We have housing that's on a combination of reserve, and so all of those pieces are still in progress. So with respect to those specific parcels, what we call the north and south parcels. Primarily, negotiating with BC Hydro over rights of way, trying to figure out how to transfer houses that were on Crown land and not have us be liable for contamination caused by houses that were built there, and gravel pit operations for various ministries, and how do we ensure there's still gravel for the roads and still ensure that the lands can be transferred. So those types of conversations are what are taking place. And then of course, those land transfers can be requested at any point by the nation. But there's still negotiations that have to take place, because if you look in the agreement, it talks about dealing with the interests on the land. So we're looking at that out for all of the other parcels as well, right? In the second round, we have what we're referring to as the Sea to Sky parcel, which is south of Alice Lake. We're looking at the area to the west of Marin Park, and engaging with those user groups and saying, okay, are these uses incompatible with what the nation has planned? If so, how do we adjust that, right? And is that going to be in the next 10 years? Is it going to be in the next 25 years? So just because there's an option triggered in the agreement doesn't mean the nation will necessarily request for that land to be transferred. Kind of as I was indicating before, sometimes there's a benefit to waiting, knowing that they have the option, but maybe they're not ready to do something with a piece of land. So it might be advantageous to just wait. But for each of those groups, and then the third tranche is primarily a forestry interest. With respect to, I think there's a couple of pieces that are in the community forest, and how are we going to deal with that? Are there other options? So we kind of stage out the work and say, okay, here's how long the conversation's going to take. With respect to where we're at in the process, we are at that, hopefully by this point we have all of the interests. Sometimes I'm still hearing, by the way, you missed this one. So then we have to go and start the conversation with that group, and then try to facilitate the conversation of talking with the nation, and then negotiating any arrangements and how that takes place. So
we're still very much in that conversational state.
Absolutely, yeah. And that does tend to take years.
Yeah.
So depending on the complication or the complexities on the different lands, moving gravel pits or well-established areas that people still want to keep using, and how can we meet that need? And what I was talking about, I guess, earlier about looking at some potential liability, and what are we asking people to take on, and how can we mitigate that?
Thank you for that context. I think in our very recreation-focused community, I think some people react with fear rather than understanding that this is an opportunity for dialogue.
Yeah.
And for learning about how the nation may want to use the lands, and how their recreational use may or may not fit into that, but it's part of an ongoing conversation. It's not like it's going to happen top level.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that context, because it sort of takes the fear out of.
Yeah, and we're looking for, like, we have no interest, and I have no interest in coming in and causing friction. It's been a shift in our thinking as well. When I'm looking at downtown Victoria and I'm being told, well, the nation can have the underlying title and we can just put your government building on top of it. It's like, right. Well, how would that be different if it was another landholder? So I think a lot of it is kind of building understanding, and that's part of the public engagement that we're looking at trying to do more of with the limited resources. So it is a bit reactive, and I wish it wasn't so reactive, but yeah.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Councillor Herford, Councillor Pettengill, and I'll put myself on the list.
Thank you. Mary Light's questions were sort of down the same line, but I suppose, when does the ministry step back, besides putting the user groups together? Are you at that table, sort of helping facilitate what that discussion, and is there a need to be sort of a level of agreement around before it's in motion? I don't really understand that threshold as we do continue to have these discussions in our community with the various user groups and so on.
Yeah, it really depends. I've had some groups and some nations say, you're not welcome at this meeting. It's between us and the local government. Thank you for making the contacts. Out you go. perfect. As long as that goes well, let me know if there's something I can do or something I can bring to the thing. I've also had others where, I've had to meet with groups separately a number of times to build understanding to the point where when they go to a meeting, it's going to be a productive conversation, because people don't always have context for, like, particularly if it's a treaty issue or something like that. You get that, well, what does this mean for me? Does that, is my woodlot going to be gone tomorrow? Like, this is a family business, and, so trying to address issues so we can get down to, like, what the actual interests are, and then bringing people together. And then sometimes I'm there once, twice, sometimes I'm there for, a couple of years. It just depends on when the conversation can take place, and I'm not needed or bringing anything useful to it. So, yeah. No quick answer.
I appreciate that, yeah.
Councillor Bettendale.
So, I really appreciate that we're trying to recognize, unceded territories, what that means and what our obligations are. But I guess I still struggle with some things, and maybe you can help me just sort of work through it a bit. But, at all three levels of government, we acknowledge we're on unceded territories, and I think that applies to both the private and Crown lands. I can understand why we try and resolve Crown lands first, but it does apply to all the land, I think. And so, I guess a piece of this is, do we plan to, at some point of reconciliation, plan to do something about the private lands that are on these unceded territories? And somewhat related to that, we recognize there's a lot of inequities still, and when you look at the justice system, and a lot of, just challenge, because of the history, there's still a lot of inequity. And we talk about reconciliation, but these agreements always seem to come in the context of, a hockey owner wants to do a mountain resort, or an Indonesian billionaire wants to do a fossil fuel facility, and then we get very busy sort of working on accommodation and so on. And for me, the fact that we're making these things contingent on us receiving more benefit, like as settlers, we've already received and continue to receive a whole bunch of benefit from being on these unceded territories. So I guess when or how do we start just dealing with the unceded piece and not making these things contingent, and can we call it reconciliation when we're making these agreements contingent? And from a First Nation perspective, I can understand for pragmatic reasons and looking at the circumstances why they may feel it's important to enter into some of these agreements. But from a settler side, I guess, how do we sort of move forward and sort of do a bit better than we're doing even now, recognizing that we're trying to make progress, but how do we go further?
Well, I think it kind of goes down to, or it comes down to where I sort of started talking about reconciliation, talking about what each nation wants, right? I hear where you're coming from and understand what you're saying, and absolutely we have a ton of work to do. But I think it's also a matter of, while you're talking about, like, there's some very specific activities that happen around development or Olympics or other things like that, right? And those can be drivers for us and government to bring something forward, or sometimes for nations to bring something forward, because they'll have opportunities and they want to ensure that those are recognized. But we just need to be careful that also we're not further pushing our agenda by saying this is something that we feel we need to deal with. So it goes back to, what does each nation want, and how do they want to engage with us? Because that, to me, is kind of the respectful way of working on that, while also in parallel working on things like, the UNDRIP legislation. How are we going to address, as a broader province, things like the commitment made to implement this, right? And what does that mean? And so I think it's kind of a two-pronged approach, right? Like, the system that's in place was, anyway, it's the system that's in place. But how do we turn that into something that's a positive, and how do we do that in concert with individual nations, what they're looking for, what they want from us, and also, bringing along the broader public, and, the province and the country. And, you know, BC's got a bit of a different context than the rest of the country when it comes to treaties and what exists and what doesn't exist, and not necessarily saying that, talking about like the validity of those treaties and the context that they were created under. But I think we go one step up and say, you know, what does reconciliation mean? Well, in part it means whatever our personal views are, what is the nation looking for? And what is this nation looking for? Because they might have nothing to do with each other, right? It might be, like, right now, what's important to this nation is housing and childcare, and that's what we want to start on, and okay, let's engage in that conversation. These other pieces will still be coming up, you know, we will still have economic development things, we will still have pieces that we want to push forward, and the nations will still have pieces that they very much want to push forward. And that's that tension of a system that's absolutely not perfect. But how are we approaching those conversations, and how are we entering into that conversation? So I think some of the pieces, like with the government now coming out, like I've been doing this for about 12 years, and having come from working, you know, Métis Nation, BC, and working with other nations and that background. And the difference in the approach that we're taking now versus what we took 10, 12 years ago, you know, even in the last few years, where we're now saying, you know, there are inherent rights. I couldn't say that 3 years ago speaking on behalf of a government, right? It wasn't in my mandate to acknowledge that. It was, you know, what has been shown and what's been proven in court, that's what's there. Now this government has taken the view of, okay, you know, we're going to start off with, there were people here before before Europeans came. So I think it's a shift. I think it's also a very much long-term piece, but I think part of how we do what you're looking for is that combination of what can the provincial government do, what can the federal government do, and then what can we do on an individual engagement basis with the nations.
Thank you. You're right, it's changed. I can remember my first term on council, which started in 2008. And one of the first things we received was notice that the province was transferring 1,800 acres of prime land in and around Squamish to the Squamish Nation. It came as a complete shock to everybody. Mm-hmm. And the thought that it all might get added to reserve and so forth, and just sort of go off in a different direction from our OCP and so forth. And we've done a lot better. We had a lot more consultation in this go-around for sure. But I was wondering, you know, part of it is, and you've heard it from other local governments, I'm sure, about these things happen and all of a sudden they're out there in the public, and a lot of stakeholders somehow get missed out in that. And I don't want to get specific, but I'm sure members of council have received emails over the last few days since this agenda item was published by groups claiming lack of consultation. Yeah. And so when I think about that, I was wondering if maybe the process could use something like, you know, if the Crown is contemplating giving a tenure, they advertise and say, we're thinking about a tenure here, comments come in, you've got so long to. Is there anything like that might come into this process so that the public at some point, maybe not, certainly there's some I'm sure that takes place behind closed doors, but at some point before final decisions are made, the public kind of is made a little bit more aware of what's going on?
And I think we're definitely moving in a direction where we're trying to get out there better, like sooner and more deliberately. I think the challenge as always is, you know, number of resources, and like I know Mayor Elliott said earlier, like I had come and engaged when I was like, here are the lands for the Squamish LNG agreement, and then it was, you know, I heard some feedback and some pieces were removed, and hey, maybe this didn't make sense, and well, we've got to pick this or this, what makes more sense, what works for council. And then you didn't really hear anything from me until it was, by the way, we're getting closer, or there's a new council, should we do an update? A lot of the times it's because there are several years of delay or of ongoing conversations, depending on who wants to engage on what topic, right? Whether the nation is saying this isn't important right now or this isn't important. So it will actually basically sit there with that information, and until it starts going again, we don't really bring it up. So I think that there's different ways. Like, so there's some, in some cases, we engage regularly, or we're on an agenda once a year for, the quarterly meeting of the Indigenous Relations Group in some areas, or the Treaty Advisory Council in other areas. And I think that what we're trying to do is figure out how best to engage more regularly with council when it's just sporadic agreements versus like something like a treaty where there's ongoing conversations. Even if it's just oh, by the way, nothing's changed, talk to you again in 6 months. But also, there's been a lot of conversation internally, particularly same thing in the last couple of years, over how do we engage the public, right? We are not doing the best job of explaining to the public, what is reconciliation? Why are we doing some of the things? What is the sort of constitutional background for what we're doing? What's the legal background for what we're doing? What's the purposeful move towards some of the conversations, moving them out of the courts and out of litigation into the more reconciliation, relationship, ongoing dialogue place, moving into that place, right? So I think that we are moving towards, like, I know internally we're having a number of conversations of how can we better engage the public. There's been some workshops done across the province on sort of, what do you guys know? How are we doing? And the feedback is definitely we need to do better. And that's something that, okay, so how do we do that? And how do we put into place, okay, do we start talking about, here's the groups that we've identified. If we've missed anyone, can you please put your hand up now? That's been a very real conversation of, there's been pieces that, obviously have been missed because occasionally a report or a layer doesn't show up on a computer somewhere. And that results in all sorts of negative issues, and that's not something we want to be kind of the final be all and end all of why we're engaging with people. So I don't have kind of a set answer, just that, it is very much something we're aware of. It's definitely something that's been brought up in the last couple of years, and we're trying to come up with a better, how do we engage the public, and how do we make sure people aren't missed. And so, for instance, out of one of the conversations we had on these lands, it became apparent that I wasn't seeing a layer on trails. And so now we've got a whole group internally on the lands portion who is like, okay, how do we fix it so that we don't miss layers? Because this is not something that results in what we want, which is a positive relationship.
Thank you. So I'm cognizant of time. So we'll start wrapping it up. That's Councillor Pettengill.
So just in relation to your last comment about engagement, at this point, are there any grants or resources for a municipality? Like if we see a user group has some questions or concerns about parts of an agreement, and we recognize, there's actually some gaps in understanding, and at the local level, we think we could facilitate some of that understanding in terms of the importance of that place, the place names and some of those things. Is that something your ministry can provide to us, and then we can maybe do some of that work on the ground?
So I'm not aware of any specific, like my ministry doesn't tend to do grants to, like as far as that type of engagement. I don't know that there wouldn't necessarily be, when you look at more the municipal affairs side, if there's engagement funding. I just don't know at this point, but that is something that I could look into and get back to you, because I don't want to give you wrong information.
Yeah, just quickly, Christie, since this is being broadcast live and will be archived forever, and our local media is here, if there are groups that feel they are impacted by this land agreement and don't feel they've been consulted yet, do they contact you, or what is their best thing to do?
I am the contact point. So I've done what I can with respect to trying to, here's the agreement, it's posted externally. I hope I haven't missed anybody else. I'm sure I probably have missed somebody, but definitely, absolutely, I would be the contact person. So I think, I know I've got on the slides, it doesn't work for me. Let's try this one. So contact me. Jennifer Spencer is, she's going to be helping out more specifically as time goes forward, but with respect to who would be the lead on this, that would be me.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
I just thought I'd help you get the
nope.
message out.
I'm right here. If I missed anybody, no, absolutely. I know I'm sort of smiling and chuckling about it, but you know, I'm an Indigenous person. I've been a climber for 22 years. I've, you know, been in, out, and around the Squamish Nation territory, and I'm super lucky to be able to live where I live. And no, absolutely. Like I want to ensure that, you know, I get all the information possible and build the best relationships possible when we do these agreements. And so yeah, please give me a shout.
Thank you, it's been very helpful.
With that, thank you. I'm going to wrap it up.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for coming over, Christie. That's been very helpful.
Thank you. And I will get back to you on that.
And that is the last item on our agenda. So
Motion terminate?
moved by the mayor, seconded by Councillor Herford. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much.